The arrival of the Black Death in England during the summer of 1448 marked one of the most catastrophic events in the nation's history, a pandemic so devastating that it would fundamentally alter every aspect of English society, economy, culture, and political structure for centuries to come. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The bacterium responsible for this unprecedented mortality, Yersinia pestis, had originated in the arid plains of Central Asia during the early decades of the 14th century, where it circulated among rodent populations in relative obscurity until favorable conditions enabled its transmission to human communities through the bite of infected fleas. The pathogen's journey westward followed the intricate web of trade routes that connected the Mongol Empire's vast territories with Mediterranean commercial centers, moving through caravansaries and trading posts with the same efficiency that characterized the movement of silk, spices, and precious metals. The disease reached the Crimean port of Kaffa in 1346, where Genoese merchants maintained a fortified trading colony that served as a crucial link between Asian and European commercial networks. The siege of Kaffa by Mongol forces created conditions that accelerated the plague's transmission, with contemporary accounts describing how attacking forces catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls in what may represent one of history's earliest documented instances of biological warfare. The Genoese merchants who fled Kaffa carried the pestilence with them aboard ships that sailed across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean, touching at ports throughout the region and initiating local outbreaks wherever they made landfall. By 1347, the plague had established itself in Constantinople, Alexandria, and various Italian city-states, creating a pattern of urban devastation that would soon spread throughout the European continent. The disease's arrival in Western Europe proceeded through multiple maritime pathways, with infected ships reaching Marseille, Genoa, and Venice during the autumn of 1347 and the spring of 1348. From these Mediterranean entry points, the plague spread northward through established trade routes, following river valleys and overland commercial pathways that connected southern European markets with the prosperous regions of France, the Low Countries, and eventually the British Isles. The pandemic reached Paris by the summer of 1348, creating panic among the French court and urban population as mortality rates climbed to levels that overwhelmed existing burial practices and social institutions. Contemporary chroniclers described scenes of unprecedented horror as bodies accumulated faster than they could be interred. Families were destroyed within days of the first symptoms appearing, and the normal functioning of urban life collapsed under the weight of mass death. The plague's progression northward continued through the summer months, with outbreaks reported in Normandy and Brittany by mid-1348, positioning the disease at the southern edge of the English Channel and making England's infection merely a matter of time, given the extensive maritime connections that linked English ports with continental trading centres. English authorities possessed limited awareness of the catastrophe unfolding across the Channel during the early months of 1348. Though fragmentary reports from continental correspondents and returning travellers provided disturbing accounts of widespread mortality and social disruption in French and Italian territories, King Edward III, who had been engaged in ongoing military campaigns against France as part of the conflict that would later be termed the 100 Years' War, received intelligence about plague outbreaks affecting both French civilian populations and military forces, information that initially appeared to offer strategic advantages by weakening England's primary adversary. The English court's understanding of disease causation reflected prevailing medieval medical theories that attributed pestilence to corrupted air, astrological influences, divine punishment for human sinfulness, or various combinations of these factors. The medical establishment, trained in universities that emphasized classical Greek and Roman texts, particularly the works of Galen and Hippocrates, interpreted epidemic disease through the framework of humoral theory and environmental miasmas. This theoretical understanding, while scientifically inaccurate, shaped both official and popular responses to the approaching pandemic, influencing everything from public health measures to religious interpretations of the plague's meaning and significance. The plague's actual arrival in England occurred during June of 1348, when an infected ship reached the Dorset port of Melcombe Regis, modern-day Weymouth, initiating the pandemic's spread throughout the southern counties. The port's commercial connections with continental markets, particularly the wine trade with Gascony and other French territories, created regular maritime traffic that facilitated the pathogen's transmission across the channel. Contemporary sources, including the chronicle accounts of Geoffrey Le Baker and other 14th century writers, identify Melcombe Regis as the initial point of entry, though some historians have suggested that multiple simultaneous introductions may have occurred at different English ports given the extensive maritime trade networks linking England with infected continental regions. The disease's establishment in Dorset proceeded rapidly, with local mortality becoming apparent within weeks of the first cases appearing. The infected individuals experienced the characteristic symptoms of bubonic plague, including the sudden onset of fever, severe weakness, and the development of painful swellings, called buboes, in the lymph nodes of the neck, armpits, and groin. These buboes, which gave the bubonic form of plague its name, represented the body's immune response to bacterial infection and could grow to the size of apples, causing excruciating pain before sometimes rupturing and draining. The pneumonic form of plague, which affected the lungs and could be transmitted directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, proved even more rapidly fatal, with victims typically dying within 2 or 3 days of symptom onset. The septicemic form, involving overwhelming bacterial infection of the bloodstream, caused death so quickly that the characteristic buboes sometimes failed to develop, leading to confusion among contemporary observers about whether these rapid deaths resulted from the same disease affecting other victims. The plague spread from its initial landing point in Dorset, followed the predictable pathways of medieval English commerce and communication, moving along established roads and waterways that connected market towns and urban centres throughout the southern regions. Bristol, one of England's largest and most prosperous ports, experienced its first cases by August of 1348, probably through maritime connections with Dorset and direct trade links with infected continental ports. The city's dense population, estimated at between 10,000 and 15,000 inhabitants, created ideal conditions for rapid disease transmission, with multiple families often sharing single buildings and sanitation systems remaining primitive by any standard. Bristol's death toll climbed precipitously through late summer and autumn, with contemporary accounts suggesting that the city lost approximately 40% of its population before the outbreak subsided. The psychological impact of such mortality rates cannot be overstated, as survivors witnessed the deaths of family members, neighbours, and community leaders on a scale that challenged fundamental assumptions about social stability and divine providence. London, the kingdom's capital, and by far its largest urban centre with perhaps 80,000 inhabitants, recorded its first plague deaths in early November of 1348, initiating an outbreak that would devastate the city through the winter and following spring. The disease's arrival in London marked a crucial turning point in the pandemic's English trajectory, as the capital's administrative, commercial, and religious centrality meant that mortality there would have ripple effects throughout the entire kingdom. The plague's clinical manifestations, as observed and recorded by contemporary physicians and chroniclers, revealed the disease's terrifying efficiency in killing previously healthy individuals within days or even hours of symptom onset. Medieval medical practitioners, working within theoretical frameworks that bore no relationship to actual bacterial infection, proposed various explanations for the plague's causation and recommended treatments that ranged from the useless to the actively harmful. The theory of miasma, which attributed disease to corrupted or poisoned air, led to recommendations for avoiding foul-smelling places and purifying the air through the burning of aromatic woods and herbs. Some physicians advocated bloodletting and purging as means of restoring humoral balance, treatments that weakened already sick patients and almost certainly increased mortality rates. Others recommended fleeing affected areas, advice that proved somewhat effective for those wealthy enough to own country estates, but also contributed to the disease's geographical spread, as infected individuals carried the plague to previously unaffected regions. The role of rats and fleas in plague transmission remained completely unknown to medieval observers, who noticed the association between plague outbreaks and the mysterious deaths of rodents, but lacked any conceptual framework for understanding the epidemiological connection. The black rat, Rattus rattus, served as the primary reservoir for plague bacteria in medieval England, while the rat flea, Xenopsilla chiopis, functioned as the vector transmitting the pathogen from infected rodents to human hosts. When plague killed the rat populations in a given area, the fleas abandoned their dead hosts and sought blood meals from available alternatives, including humans, cats, and other mammals, thereby initiating human plague outbreaks. This ecological dynamic meant that plague spread through English communities in waves, with initial human cases appearing after local rat populations had already been decimated by the disease. The social and economic disruption caused by the plague's arrival in England during the autumn and winter of 1348 manifested across every level of society, from the royal court to the humblest agricultural labourers. The administrative machinery of royal government struggled to maintain normal operations as clerks, officials, and bureaucrats succumbed to disease or fled their posts seeking safety in rural retreats. The Exchequer, which managed royal finances and taxation, saw its operations significantly disrupted, with revenue collection becoming irregular and accounting procedures falling behind as personnel losses mounted. Parliament, which had been scheduled to meet in January of 1349, was prorogued due to the plague's impact on London and the difficulty of assembling representatives from plague-affected regions. The royal court itself experienced mortality among its members, though King Edward and his immediate family avoided infection through timely withdrawal to rural residences and careful isolation from potentially infected populations. The nobility, with their country, estates, and ability to move away from urban plague centres, generally experienced lower mortality rates than urban populations or rural peasantry, who lacked the resources to flee or the land to sustain themselves in isolation. However, even the aristocracy could not entirely escape the plague's reach, with numerous noble families experiencing deaths that disrupted inheritance patterns and created succession crises. The Church, whose members maintained close contact with dying plague victims through their pastoral duties and administration of last rites, suffered particularly heavy losses that would have long-term consequences for English religious institutions. The English Church's response to the plague combined practical assistance to the sick and dying with theological interpretations that emphasized divine judgment and the need for spiritual repentance. Bishops issued pastoral letters encouraging prayer, penance, and moral reform, while organizing processions and special services intended to placate divine wrath. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Stratford, who had been involved in various political disputes with the Crown during the preceding years, issued directives to his clergy regarding the modification of certain religious practices in light of the emergency conditions created by the plague. With the number of dying individuals overwhelming the normal capacity of priests to provide individual attention and last rites, the Archbishop authorized shortened versions of traditional deathbed rites and even permitted lay people to hear confessions and grant absolution in cases where no priest was available, a remarkable departure from normal ecclesiastical practice that reflected the desperate circumstances created by mass mortality. Monasteries and convents, with their concentrated populations living in close quarters, experienced devastating losses that sometimes approached or exceeded 50% of their members. The Franciscan and Dominican orders, whose members worked extensively in urban environments and maintained close contact with lay populations, suffered particularly severe mortality that significantly reduced their numbers and influence. The deaths of so many experienced religious personnel created immediate practical problems, as parishes found themselves without priests to celebrate Mass. Monasteries lacked personnel to maintain their daily offices and economic operations, and the entire administrative structure of the Church experienced disruption that would require years to repair. The agricultural economy, which formed the foundation of England's predominantly rural society, experienced profound disruption as plague mortality removed essential labour at critical points in the farming calendar. The plague's arrival in southern England during the summer months of 1348 affected harvest operations, with some crops left partially or entirely unharvested due to labour shortages caused by death and flight. The autumn planting season, crucial for the following year's grain production, was similarly disrupted in many areas as communities struggled to maintain agricultural operations with depleted populations. The manorial system, which organised agricultural production around the estates of lords, with labour provided by tenant farmers and serfs owing various forms of service, faced immediate challenges as the deaths of tenants created vacancies that could not be easily filled. Lords found themselves with land but insufficient labour to work it, while surviving peasants discovered that their labour had suddenly become more valuable due to its scarcity. This fundamental shift in the supply and demand for agricultural labour would have revolutionary implications for English, social and economic structures, though these changes would manifest gradually over the following decades rather than immediately. The winter of 1348 to 1349 saw the plague continue its devastation in regions already affected, while spreading into new areas, including East Anglia, the Midlands, and increasingly into northern England. The disease's transmission slowed somewhat during the coldest months, possibly due to reduced flea activity in cold weather, but outbreaks continued throughout the winter in urban areas where population density and the presence of heated buildings maintained conditions suitable for disease transmission. The urban experience of plague differed significantly from rural patterns, with cities and large towns experiencing compressed periods of intense mortality that overwhelmed civic institutions and traditional burial practices. London's plague outbreak, which reached its peak during the winter and spring of 1349, created scenes that contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe adequately. The normal churchyards quickly filled beyond capacity, necessitating the establishment of emergency burial grounds outside the city walls, where victims could be interred in mass graves. The Bishop of London consecrated several such emergency cemeteries, including a large plot at Smithfield donated by Sir Walter Manny for the burial of plague victims. The dead were transported to these burial grounds in carts that made regular rounds through city streets, collecting bodies from houses marked with crosses or other symbols indicating the presence of plague victims. The psychological trauma experienced by survivors who witnessed this daily spectacle of mass death manifested in various ways, from religious ecstasy and penitential movements, to social breakdown and challenges to traditional authority structures. The city's commercial activities contracted dramatically as markets emptied, workshops closed due to the deaths of artisans and masters, and trade declined as merchants either died or ceased operations. The Port of London, normally bustling with ships from continental and English coastal ports, saw maritime traffic drop precipitously as sailors and merchants avoided the infected city. The economic consequences extended far beyond London itself, as the capital's role as the centre of English commerce meant that disruption there created ripple effects throughout the entire kingdom's trading networks. The spring of 1349 brought the plague's continued advance into northern England and Wales, regions that had remained relatively unaffected during the initial outbreak months. York, the North's primary urban and administrative centre, experienced its first plague deaths in the spring, initiating an outbreak that would devastate the city through the summer months. The city's population, estimated at between 10,000 and 13,000 before the plague, probably lost around 40% of its inhabitants by the time the outbreak subsided. Durham, Newcastle, and other northern towns experienced similar mortality rates as the plague progressed through the region, following commercial and communication routes. The rural counties of Yorkshire, Lancashire, and Northumberland saw the disease spread more slowly through dispersed agricultural communities, but mortality there still reached substantial levels that disrupted local economies and social structures. Wales received the plague both through maritime connections with English ports and overland transmission from the English border regions, with urban centres like Cardiff and rural parishes throughout the Principality experiencing significant losses. Scotland, which maintained complex political relationships with England, characterized by periods of both conflict and cooperation, initially hoped that the Anglo-Scottish border might provide some protection against the plague's advance. However, the disease reached Scotland by late 1349, probably through maritime connections with continental ports and overland transmission from northern England, initiating outbreaks that would continue through 1350 and beyond. The cumulative mortality from the plague's first visitation to England, which contemporary sources sometimes call the Great Pestilence or Great Mortality, has been the subject of extensive historical and demographic analysis by modern scholars, attempting to reconstruct population levels and death tolls from fragmentary medieval evidence. Contemporary chroniclers frequently claimed that 1/3, 1/2, or even more of the population died, figures that historians have debated regarding their literal accuracy versus rhetorical function. Modern demographic studies, utilizing evidence from manorial records, ecclesiastical documents, tax records, and archaeological excavations, generally suggest that England's population, which stood at approximately 4 to 6 million people before the plague's arrival, declined by between 30 and 45% over the period from 1348 to 1350. This translates to mortality of perhaps 2 million people. Though regional variations were substantial, with some communities experiencing losses exceeding 60%, while others suffered more moderate mortality, around 20 to 30%. Urban areas generally experienced higher death rates than rural regions, though rural mortality was still severe and had disproportionate economic impact, given agriculture's foundational role in medieval society. The causes of death variation between communities remain subjects of scholarly investigation, with factors including population density, timing of the outbreak relative to seasonal agricultural cycles, availability of food supplies, and possibly genetic variations in human susceptibility, all potentially contributing to differential mortality rates. The immediate aftermath of the plague's first wave left English society fundamentally altered, with survivors confronting a transformed world in which familiar social, economic, and cultural patterns had been disrupted beyond easy repair. The demographic catastrophe created labor shortages across virtually all sectors of the economy, from agricultural work to skilled artisan trades to domestic service. The sudden scarcity of labor gave surviving workers unprecedented leverage in negotiating wages and working conditions, challenging the fixed social hierarchies that had characterized medieval English society. Peasants who had previously been bound to manorial estates through serfdom and customary obligations discovered that lords desperate for labor were willing to offer reduced rents, commuted labor services, and even cash wages to retain tenants who might otherwise move to more favorable situations. The mobility of labor, previously restricted by legal and customary constraints, increased dramatically as workers moved between manors, seeking better terms, despite legal attempts to prevent such movement. Landlords faced difficult choices between accepting the new economic realities by offering competitive terms to their tenants, or attempting to enforce traditional obligations through legal coercion, an approach that would eventually contribute to social unrest and conflict. The urban craft economy experienced similar pressures, with guild restrictions and traditional training requirements challenged by labor shortages that created opportunities for workers to demand higher wages and better conditions. Domestic servants, whose labor was essential for wealthy households, found themselves able to negotiate improved treatment and compensation from employers who could no longer take their services for granted. The government's response to these economic disruptions reflected the Crown's alliance with landholding interests and its concern about maintaining traditional social hierarchies despite the changed demographic. Circumstances. The Ordinance of Labourers, issued by King Edward III in June of 1349, while the plague was still ravaging parts of the kingdom, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict workers' ability to move between employers. The ordinance required able-bodied individuals to work for whoever required their services at the rates that had prevailed before the plague, effectively attempting to prevent workers from exploiting their newly scarce labor to demand better terms. The legislation reflected the landed class's determination to prevent the plague's demographic consequences from undermining their economic interests and social position, an effort that would prove largely futile in the face of fundamental supply and demand dynamics. The ordinance's enforcement relied on local officials, including justices of the peace and manorial courts, who had limited capacity to prevent labor mobility or compel wage compliance in circumstances where workers had viable alternatives. The legislation was reissued in more detailed form as the Statute of Labourers in 1351, with enhanced penalties and enforcement mechanisms, but the fundamental problem remained that employers competing for scarce labour had incentives to violate wage controls by offering higher pay to attract workers. The statute's provisions extended beyond wage controls to address various aspects of social behaviour that authorities perceived as problematic, including restrictions on begging, requirements for able-bodied individuals to work, and efforts to prevent social mobility through consumption restrictions that prohibited lower-class individuals from wearing clothing or consuming foods deemed appropriate only for higher social ranks. The religious and cultural responses to the plague reflected medieval Christianity's interpretation of epidemic disease as divine punishment for human sinfulness, an understanding that shaped both individual and collective reactions to the catastrophe. Preaching and religious literature from the plague period emphasized themes of mortality, judgment, and the need for repentance, with vivid descriptions of death and decomposition intended to shock audiences into spiritual reform. The Danse Macabre or Dance of Death motif, which would become prominent in later medieval art and literature, presented allegorical scenes of death claiming victims from all social ranks, from popes and emperors to peasants and children, emphasizing mortality's universal reach and the futility of earthly status and wealth. This leveling message resonated powerfully with plague survivors who had witnessed death's seemingly random selection of victims, regardless of age, wealth, or social position. The increased emphasis on personal mortality and divine judgment influenced testamentary practices, with wills from the plague period often including more extensive provisions for prayers for the dead, charitable bequests, and other measures intended to reduce time spent in purgatory. Chantry chapels, where priests celebrated masses for the souls of deceased founders, proliferated in the decades following the plague, as wealthy individuals sought to ensure post-mortem spiritual assistance. The cult of saints associated with plague protection, particularly Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch, grew in prominence as communities sought supernatural assistance against disease. Parish churches began installing screens painted with images of saints and scenes of mortality, creating visual programs that reminded congregants of death's inevitability and the importance of maintaining proper spiritual preparation. The flagellant movement, which emerged in continental Europe during the plague years and briefly appeared in England, represented a more extreme religious response that challenged ecclesiastical authority while claiming to offer direct access to divine mercy through public penance. The flagellants, who processed through towns and villages whipping themselves until they drew blood, claimed that their penitential suffering would persuade God to lift the plague's punishment. The movement's implicit challenge to the Church's mediating role between humanity and the divine, along with its potential to inspire social disorder, led to official condemnation by both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull in October of 1349, condemning the flagellants and ordering their suppression, while English authorities similarly moved to prevent the movement from gaining significant traction in the kingdom. The movement's limited impact in England, compared to its more extensive presence in German territories and other continental regions, probably reflected both effective official suppression and the English Church's success in channeling penitential energies into orthodox religious practices. However, the flagellants' brief appearance highlighted the potential for religious enthusiasm to evolve into challenges to established authority, a tension that would periodically resurface in later medieval English religious life. The plague's impact on English cultural and intellectual life manifested in various developments that would influence the kingdom's artistic, literary, and educational character for generations. The deaths of numerous clergy and university personnel disrupted educational institutions and intellectual networks, creating gaps in teaching and scholarship that required years to repair. Oxford and Cambridge universities both experienced significant mortality among their members, with college communities, similar to monasteries, suffering from the concentrated populations and close quarters that facilitated disease transmission. The university's recovery required recruitment of new scholars and the reorganization of college structures to accommodate reduced numbers, processes that created opportunities for educational reforms and curricular changes. The vernacular literature that emerged in the decades following the plague often reflected themes of mortality, social criticism, and religious questioning that suggested the pandemic's influence on cultural consciousness. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, composed in the later 14th century, presented a cross-section of English society, whose members told stories reflecting the social tensions, religious controversies, and cultural anxieties of the post-plague world. William Langland's Piers Plowman, an allegorical poem addressing spiritual and social reform, engaged with questions about labor, social obligation, and religious authenticity that had been thrown into sharp relief by the plague's disruption of traditional social arrangements. The development of English vernacular literature in the later 14th century, moving away from the French and Latin that had dominated elite literary culture, may have been accelerated by the plague's impact on educated elites and the social mobility that enabled lower status individuals to achieve positions previously reserved for their social superiors. The architectural legacy of the plague years revealed itself through interrupted construction projects, modified building plans, and the eventual development of new architectural styles reflecting changed aesthetic preferences and economic circumstances. Major ecclesiastical building projects that had been underway when the plague struck experienced delays or abandonment as funding dried up. Skilled craftsmen died, and priorities shifted to addressing immediate crisis needs, rather than long-term, monumental construction. Westminster Abbey, which had been undergoing extensive rebuilding under royal patronage, saw its construction timeline extended as resources and labour became scarce. Many parish churches that had been planning expansions or renovations postponed such projects indefinitely, sometimes resulting in hybrid structures where plague-era interruptions created permanent discontinuities in architectural style. The perpendicular Gothic style that became characteristic of later medieval English ecclesiastical architecture emerged in the decades following the plague, featuring more vertical lines, larger windows, and lighter overall proportions than earlier Gothic styles. While the perpendicular style's development cannot be attributed solely to the plague, the pandemic's economic and social consequences probably influenced both the practical constraints and aesthetic preferences that shaped architectural evolution in the late medieval period. The decades following the plague's initial visitation saw periodic recurrences of epidemic disease that prevented demographic recovery and maintained pressure on English society. A second major plague outbreak struck England in 1361 to 1362, affecting primarily children and young adults who had been born after the first epidemic and therefore lacked any acquired immunity to the disease. This children's pestilence, as contemporary sources termed it, caused significant mortality among the post-plague generation, further delaying demographic recovery and creating psychological trauma as parents who had survived the first plague now watched their children die in the second. Additional plague outbreaks occurred in 1369, 1375, and 1390, each causing substantial mortality, though generally not approaching the catastrophic levels of the initial 1348 to 1350 epidemic. The recurring nature of plague created a cultural environment in which epidemic disease became an expected rather than exceptional feature of life, influencing everything from economic planning to family formation strategies. Individuals who survived multiple plague outbreaks developed a fatalistic worldview that accepted mortality's constant presence while attempting to pursue normal life activities between epidemic episodes. The biological concept of virgin soil epidemic, in which a disease first encountering a population with no prior exposure or immunity causes catastrophic mortality, helps explain why the initial plague outbreak was so much more severe than subsequent recurrences, as survivors of earlier epidemics possessed some acquired immunity that reduced their susceptibility to later infections. The economic transformation of late medieval England reflected the plague's ongoing influence through labor scarcity, changed agricultural practices, and the gradual erosion of feudal social structures. The shift from labor-intensive arable farming toward less labor-dependent pastoral agriculture accelerated in the post-plague decades as landowners adapted to labor shortages by converting ploughland to pasture for sheep, raising, wool production, which required relatively little labor compared to grain cultivation, became increasingly central to the English rural economy, with implications for both domestic cloth manufacturing and international trade. The enclosure movement, whereby landlords consolidated scattered common fields into unified sheep pastures, began to transform the English landscape, though this process would not reach its peak until later centuries. The commutation of labor services into cash rents proceeded more rapidly after the plague, as lords found cash rents more reliable and easier to collect than labor services from an increasingly mobile and independent peasantry. The market economy expanded into rural areas that had previously operated largely through subsistence agriculture and customary exchanges, as commercialization and monetization increased throughout the later 14th and 15th centuries. Urban craft production experienced guild consolidation and reorganization as depleted populations necessitated combining previously distinct trades and modifying traditional training requirements to accelerate the production of skilled workers. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which brought rebels from Essex and Kent to London in armed challenge to royal authority, reflected the accumulated tensions and frustrations that had developed in the decades since the plague's first appearance. The rebellion's immediate triggers included the imposition of poll taxes that fell heavily on common people, and attempts to enforce labor legislation that peasants viewed as unjust restrictions on their economic freedom. However, the revolt's deeper causes lay in the contradiction between the changed economic circumstances created by the plague and the efforts of landlords and government to maintain pre-plague social arrangements through legal coercion. The rebels' demands, which included the abolition of serfdom, the reduction of rents to pre-plague levels, and the punishment of corrupt officials, expressed aspirations for a more equitable social order that would recognize the enhanced value and dignity of common people's labor. The rebellion's suppression by royal forces and the execution of its leaders, including Wat Tyler and John Ball, demonstrated the Crown's commitment to maintaining traditional social hierarchies despite changed economic circumstances. However, the revolt's occurrence revealed the fragility of elite control and the potential for lower-class resistance to achieve at least partial success in improving their conditions, lessons that would influence social relations throughout the following centuries. The demographic recovery from the plague's 14th century devastation proceeded slowly and unevenly, with England's population remaining substantially below pre-plague levels throughout the 15th century. Modern demographic estimates suggest that England's population around 1400 stood at perhaps 2 to 3 million people, still significantly lower than the 4 to 6 million estimated for 1348. This prolonged demographic stagnation resulted from the combination of recurring plague outbreaks that prevented sustained population growth and changed marriage and family formation patterns that reduced fertility rates. The age structure of the post-plague population, with relatively large proportions of elderly survivors and smaller cohorts of young people born during and after the plague years, created demographic imbalances that affected everything from labor supply to inheritance patterns. The sex ratio may have been skewed by differential mortality between men and women, though evidence on this point remains ambiguous, with some studies suggesting higher female mortality, while others indicate relatively equal death rates. The psychological trauma of living through multiple plague outbreaks may have influenced reproductive decisions, with some individuals delaying marriage or limiting family size in response to mortality's omnipresent threat. The improved material conditions available to surviving populations, paradoxically a consequence of the plague's reduction of population pressure on resources, may have also influenced demographic behavior, as higher living standards sometimes correlate with lower fertility rates, as families invest more heavily in fewer children. The 15th century witnessed England's gradual adaptation to the post-plague demographic and economic realities through institutional changes, social reorganization, and cultural developments that reflected the plague's enduring influence. The manorial system's continued erosion proceeded through the growth of cash tenancies, the decline of customary labor obligations, and the increasing independence of peasant farmers who operated essentially as small-scale commercial agriculturalists. Many former serfs achieved practical freedom through the commutation of obligations and the impossibility of enforcing traditional restrictions on labor mobility in circumstances where workers had viable alternatives. The legal status of villeinage persisted in some areas, but its practical significance diminished as market forces and changed power relationships created new economic arrangements that operated largely independently of feudal legal categories. The gentry class, consisting of substantial landowners below aristocratic rank, emerged as an increasingly important social and political force in the post-plague countryside, often managing their estates more efficiently than traditional aristocrats and adapting more successfully to changed economic conditions. The urban economy experienced guild restructuring, with some crafts declining, while others expanded to meet changing consumer demands and production possibilities. London's continued growth as England's dominant urban centre accelerated in the 15th century, with the capital increasingly overshadowing other English towns in population, wealth, and political influence. The Church's institutional recovery from the plague's devastating impact on clerical personnel proceeded through accelerated recruitment and training of new priests, though concerns about declining educational and spiritual standards among clergy became recurring themes in later medieval religious discourse. The relative ease with which men could obtain benefices in the immediate post-plague years, due to the shortage of clergy, may have attracted individuals more interested in economic security than spiritual vocation, a development that reformers criticized as contributing to clerical mediocrity. The monasteries, which had suffered particularly severe mortality during the plague years, struggled to recruit new members in sufficient numbers to restore their pre-plague populations, beginning a long decline that would culminate in their dissolution under Henry VIII in the 1530s. The mendicant orders similarly failed to recover their pre-plague strength and influence, with reduced numbers limiting their ability to maintain their previous levels of pastoral activity and intellectual production. The growth of lay religious movements, including religious guilds, confraternities, and devotional associations, reflected both the laity's desire for more direct participation in religious life and the clerical shortage's practical necessity for lay people to assume religious functions previously reserved for ordained clergy. The increasing prominence of vernacular religious literature, including devotional manuals, biblical translations, and mystical writings, made sophisticated religious ideas and practices accessible to literate lay people who could read English but not Latin. The cultural memory of the plague's catastrophic impact persisted in English consciousness long after the demographic crisis had passed, influencing artistic production, literary themes, and social attitudes toward disease, death, and divine providence. The iconography of death, including tomb sculptures showing decomposing corpses, wall paintings of the Dance of Death, and various memento mori symbols, reminded viewers of mortality's inevitability and the vanity of earthly attachments. These artistic programs served didactic purposes, teaching spiritual lessons about the importance of maintaining proper priorities and preparing for death's inevitable arrival. The plague's memory also influenced medical and public health thinking, though the persistence of miasmatic theories and humoral medicine meant that practical understanding of disease causation and prevention remained limited throughout the medieval period and well into the early modern era. Quarantine practices, which had been developed in Mediterranean cities during the 14th century plague, gradually spread to England and other northern European regions, creating early public health systems that attempted to control epidemic disease through isolation of infected individuals and regulation of travel from affected areas. These measures, while based on empirically observed associations between disease and certain conditions, rather than accurate understanding of transmission mechanisms, sometimes proved effective in limiting epidemic spread through their impact on human behavior and movement patterns. The 15th century's periodic plague outbreaks, while generally less severe than the 14th century epidemics, maintained disease as a prominent feature of English life and death. Major outbreaks occurred in 1406 to 1407, 1433, 1449 to 1450, 1464 to 1465, 1479 to 1480, and 1499 to 1500, each causing significant mortality in affected areas, though rarely approaching the catastrophic levels of 1348 to 1350. The recurring nature of these epidemics created a pattern whereby population growth during inter-epidemic periods would be checked by mortality spikes during outbreak years, preventing sustained demographic recovery until plague recurrence finally diminished in the 16th century. The social and economic impact of these later medieval plague outbreaks was cushioned somewhat by the population's previous experience with epidemic disease and the institutional adaptations that had developed in response to earlier epidemics. Communities had learned to implement emergency measures, including the establishment of temporary burial grounds, the organization of relief for sick and destitute individuals, and the modification of religious practices to accommodate epidemic conditions. However, each new outbreak still created significant mortality and social disruption, particularly in urban areas where population density facilitated disease transmission. The Tudor period, beginning with Henry VII's accession in 1485, witnessed continued plague outbreaks that influenced the dynasty's political development and shaped early modern English society. The disease's impact on urban centres, particularly London, remained severe through the early 16th century, with major outbreaks in 1500 to 1503, 1513 to 1514, and 1518. Henry VIII's reign, spanning 1509 to 1547, experienced multiple plague episodes that affected royal policy and court life, including outbreaks that forced the king and court to relocate from London to safer rural locations. The dissolution of monasteries and the Protestant Reformation's religious changes complicated plague response by eliminating religious institutions that had previously provided care for the sick and burial for the dead. The creation of new poor law provisions partially addressed this institutional gap by making parishes responsible for relief of sick and impoverished parishioners, establishing precedents for state-directed social welfare that would expand in subsequent centuries. The medical profession's continued reliance on humoral theory and miasmatic explanations for plague causation meant that treatments remained largely ineffective, though some empirically derived practices, including the isolation of infected households and the use of certain herbal preparations, may have provided modest benefits, either through placebo effects or actual antimicrobial properties of some plant compounds. The Elizabethan era witnessed particularly severe plague outbreaks that tested the developing early modern state's capacity to manage epidemic disease through administrative intervention and public health regulation. The 1563 plague outbreak in London killed perhaps 20,000 people, in a city whose population had grown to approximately 100,000, creating mortality rates approaching 20% of the urban population. The 1575 outbreak, while less severe than its predecessor, still caused significant disruption to commercial and administrative activities. The 1593 plague epidemic, occurring during a period of military mobilization for campaigns against Spain, complicated the Crown's efforts to maintain military operations while protecting civilian populations from disease spread through troop movements and concentrations of soldiers in port cities. The 1563 outbreak prompted the development of more systematic plague regulations, including official procedures for identifying infected households, requirements for marking diseased houses with crosses or other symbols, and provisions for supporting families under quarantine. These regulations, while not entirely novel, represented increased governmental systematization of plague control measures and established precedents that would be refined and expanded in subsequent decades. The creation of plague orders, officially promulgated rules governing behavior during epidemic outbreaks, reflected the early modern state's growing capacity for social regulation and its willingness to intervene in traditional social practices in the name of public health and social order. The economic consequences of recurring Tudor-era plague outbreaks influenced the period's commercial development, urban growth patterns, and labour market dynamics. London's repeated epidemic experiences did not prevent its continued demographic and economic expansion, as migration from rural areas and smaller towns constantly replenished population losses from disease mortality. However, plague outbreaks did create periodic disruptions to commercial activities, with markets closing, trade declining, and production interrupting during epidemic periods. The cloth trade, which formed the backbone of England's international commerce, experienced reduced export volumes during plague years, as continental markets avoided trade with infected English ports. The internal grain trade similarly suffered during outbreaks, as communities restricted travel and commerce to prevent disease spread, sometimes creating local food shortages even when overall agricultural production remained adequate. The theatrical companies and entertainment industries that flourished in Elizabethan London faced repeated closures during plague outbreaks, as authorities banned public gatherings and ordered playhouses shut to prevent disease transmission through crowds. William Shakespeare's career as a playwright and actor unfolded against this backdrop of recurring plague closures, with the theatres experiencing mandatory shutdowns during the 1592 to 1593, 1594, 1595, 1596, and 1600 outbreaks, among others. These closures influenced theatrical companies' organisation, repertoire development, and touring activities, as troupes needed to maintain financial viability despite periodic suspensions of London performances. The Stuart period inherited the Tudor era's plague problems, along with developing more sophisticated approaches to epidemic management based on accumulated experience and evolving governmental capacities. The 1603 outbreak, occurring early in James I's reign, killed perhaps 30,000 Londoners, approximately 15% of the city's population, demonstrating that despite centuries of experience with plague, the disease retained its capacity for mass mortality. The 1625 plague, which coincided with Charles I's accession and his marriage to Henrietta Maria of France, killed approximately 40,000 London residents, creating one of the 17th century's most severe outbreaks and disrupting the new king's early reign. The 1636 outbreak, while less deadly than the 1625 epidemic, still caused significant mortality and renewed concerns about the government's capacity to manage epidemic disease. The increasing sophistication of plague regulations during this period included more detailed provisions for quarantine, the establishment of pest houses for isolating infected individuals away from their families, and the organization of relief systems for supporting families under quarantine who could not work to earn their living. The Office of Plague Searchers, typically older women employed to examine corpses and determine causes of death, became institutionalized in London and other major towns, creating an early form of mortality surveillance that enabled authorities to track epidemic spread and target control measures more effectively. The Great Plague of 1665 represented the final and most severe manifestation of the pandemic that had tormented England for over 3 centuries. The outbreak began in spring of 1665 in the poor suburban parishes outside London's walls, particularly in the Liberties of Street, Giles, where overcrowded and unsanitary conditions created ideal environments for disease transmission. The epidemic's initial focus in marginal urban areas, inhabited by wage labourers, casual workers, and the transient poor, reflected the disease's association with poverty and poor living conditions, though the plague would eventually spread to wealthier neighbourhoods as the outbreak intensified. The mortality toll mounted rapidly through the summer months, with weekly death bills recording increasing numbers of plague victims as the epidemic spread throughout the metropolitan area. Contemporary diarist Samuel Pepys recorded his observations of the epidemic's progression, noting the appearance of red crosses on infected houses, the grass growing in normally busy streets as commerce declined and residents fled or barricaded themselves indoors, and the nightly passage of death carts, collecting corpses for burial in mass graves. The King and Court withdrew from London in July, relocating to Oxford for safety, a move that reflected both the Crown's concern for its own security and the practical impossibility of conducting governmental business in a city experiencing epidemic crisis. The administrative response to the 1665 plague involved the implementation of the most comprehensive control measures yet attempted in English plague management, including the mandatory quarantine of infected households, the establishment of expanded pest house facilities, and the organization of substantial relief payments to support families unable to work due to quarantine restrictions. The policy of shutting up infected houses, whereby entire households would be confined to their dwellings if any member showed plague symptoms, generated significant controversy and resistance, as healthy family members found themselves imprisoned with sick relatives, virtually guaranteeing their own infection. The practice of appointing watchmen to guard quarantined houses and prevent residents from breaking quarantine created employment for men who otherwise would have struggled to find work during the epidemic, but also generated resentment from confined families who viewed the watchmen as jailers enforcing unjust imprisonment. The parish-based relief system that provided financial support to quarantined families distributed substantial funds raised through local taxation, demonstrating the early modern state's increasing capacity for social intervention, but also creating administrative challenges and opportunities for corruption. The mortality statistics compiled from parish registers and bills of mortality, while certainly incomplete and probably undercounting plague deaths in poor areas with inadequate record-keeping, provide unprecedented documentation of the epidemic's impact, with weekly death tolls exceeding 7,000 at the outbreak's peak in September of 1665. The total mortality from the Great Plague of 1665 has been estimated at between 75,000 and 100,000 deaths, with London's population of approximately 460,000 experiencing a death rate approaching 20% during the epidemic year. The disease's impact varied significantly between neighborhoods, with poor areas experiencing mortality rates sometimes exceeding 30%, while wealthier districts that could afford to implement more effective isolation measures and possess the resources to flee the city experienced somewhat lower death rates. The extramural parishes, located outside the city walls and containing much of London's poorest population, suffered particularly severely, with mortality rates in some parishes exceeding 40%. The City of London proper, while not spared from the epidemic, experienced somewhat lower mortality than suburban areas, reflecting both its wealthier average population and its more effective implementation of control measures. The epidemic's decline during the autumn and winter of 1665 followed the pattern of previous plague outbreaks, with cooling temperatures and reduced flea activity, slowing disease transmission, even as other factors, including the depletion of susceptible populations in heavily affected areas, contributed to the outbreak's eventual subsidence. The Great Fire of London in September of 1666, which destroyed much of the medieval city, including approximately 13,000 houses and numerous churches and public buildings, has sometimes been credited with ending the plague by eliminating the unsanitary housing conditions that had harbored disease-carrying rats and fleas. However, the plague had already declined substantially before the fire, with weekly deaths dropping to pre-epidemic levels by early 1666, suggesting that the fire's impact on plague transmission was probably limited. The fire's destruction of densely packed timber housing and its replacement with brick construction and wider streets may have improved sanitary conditions and reduced future plague risk, though the absence of plague recurrence in England after 1666 probably resulted from multiple factors, including changed rat species, distribution, quarantine practices, and possibly evolved reduced virulence of the plague bacterium. The reconstruction of London following the fire created opportunities for urban planning that incorporated emerging public health concerns, though economic pressures and property ownership complications limited the implementation of more ambitious schemes for street widening and regularized building plots. The cessation of plague as a recurring epidemic threat in England after 1666, while major outbreaks continued in continental Europe throughout the 18th century, has generated extensive historical and epidemiological investigation, attempting to explain England's apparent escape from a disease that had afflicted the kingdom for over 3 centuries. The proposed explanations include the possibility that the black rat population was displaced by the brown rat, a species less likely to live in close proximity to humans and therefore less effective as a plague reservoir, though evidence for the timing and extent of brown rat displacement remains debated. Improved housing construction standards following the Great Fire may have reduced opportunities for rats to inhabit human dwellings, thereby limiting human-rat flea contact necessary for plague transmission. Enhanced quarantine practices and more effective maritime health controls may have prevented plague-infected ships from reaching English ports or spreading the disease beyond limited introduction points. The development of some degree of population immunity through generations of exposure may have reduced susceptibility to plague infection or severity of disease among those who did become infected. Climate changes associated with the Little Ice Age may have affected either rat populations or flea breeding patterns in ways that reduced plague transmission efficiency. The gradual improvement in nutritional status among English populations may have enhanced immune resistance to infection or improved survival rates among those who did contract plague. The mystery of England's plague disappearance contrasted with the disease's continued presence in other European regions, continental Asian territories, and its eventual identification as an endemic disease in various rodent populations worldwide, illustrates the complexity of epidemic disease dynamics and the multiple factors influencing disease emergence, persistence, and disappearance. The third plague pandemic, which emerged in China during the 1890s and spread through maritime commerce to ports worldwide, demonstrated that plague retained its pandemic potential even in the era of modern medicine and public health infrastructure. The identification of Yersinia pestis as the causative bacterium by Alexandre Yersin in 1894, the subsequent understanding of rat and flea vectors, and the development of effective antibiotic treatments during the mid-20th century finally provided scientific explanations for plague transmission and effective medical interventions that previous centuries had lacked. However, these modern medical advances came too late to illuminate the mechanisms that had ended England's plague centuries earlier, leaving historians and epidemiologists to reconstruct past disease patterns from fragmentary historical evidence and theoretical models. The long-term consequences of the Black Death and subsequent plague outbreaks for English society, economy, culture, and political development extended far beyond the immediate mortality and disruption experienced during epidemic years, shaping the trajectory of English historical development in ways that influenced the nation's emergence as a major European power during the early modern period. The demographic recovery that finally occurred during the 16th century created population pressure that contributed to various social phenomena, including increased enclosure of common lands, growth of a landless labouring population, expansion of London and other urban centres, and eventually substantial emigration to colonial territories in North America and the Caribbean. The changed labour relations that emerged from the post-plague labour scarcity contributed to England's relatively early development of wage labour and market-oriented agriculture, patterns that some historians have identified as preconditions for later industrialisation. The weakening of feudal social structures and the increased social mobility that plague demographic consequences facilitated may have contributed to the emergence of a more fluid social hierarchy in which commercial wealth and education could compete with traditional aristocratic status based on landed property and noble lineage. The cultural legacy of the plague centuries manifested in English attitudes toward disease, death, public health, and governmental responsibility for population welfare. The experience of managing recurring plague outbreaks contributed to the development of public health administration, quarantine systems, and governmental regulation of social behavior in the name of disease control, establishing precedents for state intervention in areas previously considered outside governmental purview. The Bills of Mortality, first published in London during the 16th century to track plague deaths, evolved into regular statistical compilations that provided early demographic data and contributed to the development of vital statistics and epidemiology. The parish-based poor relief system that developed partly in response to plague-related needs established principles of local governmental responsibility for social welfare that would be formalized in the Elizabethan Poor Laws and persist in various forms into the modern era. The medical profession's gradual shift from humoral theory toward more empirical approaches to disease causation, while not complete until well into the modern period, was influenced by the practical experience of managing plague and other epidemic diseases through methods that sometimes proved effective even when their theoretical justification was erroneous. The commemoration and memory of the Great Plague persisted in English historical consciousness through various memorials, historical accounts, and cultural references that kept the epidemic's memory alive, even as direct experience of plague faded from living memory. Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, published in 1722, presented a fictionalized account based on extensive research into 1665 sources, creating a vivid reconstruction of the epidemic that influenced subsequent understanding of the plague's impact. Defoe's account, while not strictly historical, captured the psychological dimensions of living through epidemic crisis and contributed to the plague's enduring presence in English cultural memory. The parish churches that had buried plague victims maintained registers recording the catastrophic mortality, while memorials and monuments commemorated individuals and families lost to the disease. The plague pits, mass burial grounds used during epidemic emergencies, became part of London's urban archaeology, occasionally rediscovered during construction projects, and serving as material reminders of the city's epidemic past. The scientific understanding of plague that developed during the late 19th and 20th centuries, based on bacteriological research, ecological studies of plague reservoirs and vectors, and epidemiological investigations of modern plague outbreaks, provided retrospective explanations for the medieval and early modern plague patterns that historical sources had documented without understanding. The identification of specific genetic strains of Yersinia pestis through analysis of DNA extracted from medieval plague burial sites confirmed that the Black Death was indeed caused by plague bacteria closely related to strains still circulating in modern rodent populations. These paleogenomic studies revealed evolutionary relationships between historical plague strains and modern variants, contributing to understanding of plague's natural history and its potential for re-emergence. The recognition that pneumonic plague, transmitted directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, could have played a significant role in medieval plague outbreaks, helped explain the rapid transmission rates and high mortality that characterize some historical epidemics. The understanding that plague bacteria could persist in rural rodent populations for extended periods, creating endemic foci that could spawn new outbreaks under favorable conditions, explained the recurring nature of medieval plague and the difficulty of eliminating the disease entirely. The modern historiography of the Black Death reflects evolving methodological approaches to studying past epidemics, including demographic reconstruction using parish registers and manorial documents, archaeological excavation of plague burial sites, paleogenomic analysis of ancient DNA, climate history reconstruction to understand environmental contexts, and interdisciplinary synthesis, combining historical, scientific, and social science perspectives. The debate over plague's mortality levels, its economic consequences, and its role in late medieval social transformation continues among historians who interpret the evidence differently and emphasize various aspects of the pandemic's complex legacy. Some scholars emphasize the plague's revolutionary impact on social structures and its role in ending feudalism, while others stress continuities with pre-plague patterns and the gradual rather than sudden nature of social change. The comparison between medieval plague and modern pandemics, including the 1918 influenza pandemic, the ongoing HIV/AIDS pandemic, and the recent COVID-19 pandemic, has generated insights into universal patterns of epidemic social impact, while also highlighting the distinctive features of historical disease events shaped by specific cultural, technological, and epidemiological circumstances. The Black Death's position in English national memory occupies a complex space between historical fact, cultural mythology, and contemporary relevance. The plague's unprecedented mortality and its profound social consequences make it a defining event in English medieval history, comparable in significance to the Norman Conquest or the Reformation. The epidemic's influence on literature, art, religion, and social attitudes extended far beyond the immediate plague years, shaping late medieval and early modern culture in ways that persisted long after plague itself ceased to threaten England. The experience of managing recurring plague outbreaks contributed to evolving concepts of public health, governmental responsibility, and collective action in response to shared threats. The plague's eventual disappearance from England even as it persisted elsewhere, contributed to a sense of English exceptionalism and progress, though modern understanding recognizes that multiple factors, including chance, played roles in England's plague-free status after 1666. The study of historical plague outbreaks continues to offer insights relevant to modern pandemic preparedness and response, including the importance of surveillance systems, the challenges of balancing disease control with economic and social needs, the role of inequality in determining disease impact, and the long-term consequences of epidemic disruption for social and economic development. The Black Death in England, viewed across the long perspective from 1348 to the present, represents far more than a medical catastrophe or demographic crisis. The pandemic and its recurring manifestations fundamentally reshaped English society, contributing to transformations in social structure, economic organization, religious practice, cultural expression, and governmental function that influenced the kingdom's development through the late medieval and early modern periods. The plague's role in ending feudalism, while sometimes overstated by earlier historians who attributed too much causal power to a single factor, was nonetheless significant in creating conditions that enabled the transition from medieval to early modern social and economic patterns. The labor scarcity that followed demographic collapse gave workers unprecedented leverage that contributed to the gradual erosion of serfdom and the development of wage labor and market relationships in place of customary feudal obligations. The social mobility enabled by plague mortality, as positions vacated by deceased incumbents were filled by survivors from lower social ranks, contributed to increased fluidity in social hierarchies and reduced deference to traditional authority based solely on inherited status. The religious consequences of the plague extended beyond immediate responses to epidemic crisis to influence long-term developments in English Christianity, including the growth of vernacular spirituality, the questioning of clerical authority, and eventually the Protestant Reformation. While the Reformation's causes were multiple and complex, the late medieval church's inability to prevent plague, despite claiming spiritual authority, and its vulnerability to criticism regarding clerical quality and corruption, created conditions favorable to religious reform. The emphasis on personal mortality and direct relationship with God, themes prominent in plague-era spirituality, resonated with Protestant emphasis on individual faith and scripture rather than ecclesiastical mediation. The dissolution of monasteries under Henry VIII eliminated institutions that had been weakened by plague mortality and had never fully recovered their pre-plague strength and prestige. The development of parish-based poor relief partly reflected the need to replace monastic charity that had provided social welfare services, subsequently lost with monastic dissolution. The political consequences of the Black Death operated through various mechanisms, including the fiscal pressures created by reduced tax revenues from depleted populations, the social tensions generated by governmental attempts to enforce labor controls against economic forces, favoring workers, and the administrative challenges of maintaining governance amid recurring epidemic disruptions. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, while triggered by immediate grievances regarding poll taxes and labor legislation, reflected deeper contradictions between post-plague economic realities and governmental policies attempting to preserve pre-plague social arrangements. The revolt's suppression did not eliminate these contradictions, which continued to generate social tensions throughout the following centuries. The development of more sophisticated administrative systems for managing plague outbreaks contributed to the growth of governmental capacity and the expansion of state functions into areas including public health, social welfare, and regulation of economic activities. These expanded governmental functions, while initially justified as temporary emergency measures during plague crises, gradually became permanent features of English governance that influenced the state's evolution toward more interventionist and regulatory roles. The economic legacy of the plague centuries included England's emergence as a major wool-producing and cloth manufacturing region, the commercialization of agriculture and the growth of market-oriented farming, the expansion of wage labor and the decline of feudal service obligations, the increased importance of urban commerce and manufacturing relative to agricultural production, and the development of more sophisticated financial and commercial institutions. These economic changes, while not solely caused by plague, were significantly influenced by the demographic and social consequences of recurring epidemics. The transformation of England's economy from primarily subsistence agriculture toward commercial farming and manufacturing created foundations for later economic development, including the agricultural revolution and eventually the industrial revolution. The plague's role in this economic transformation, while indirect and operating through multiple causal pathways, represented a significant, if often overlooked, contribution to England's emergence as a leading industrial and commercial power during the modern era. The demographic impact of the Black Death and subsequent plague outbreaks extended beyond immediate mortality to influence long-term population patterns, including delayed recovery to pre-plague population levels, changed marriage ages and family formation patterns, altered sex ratios and their social implications, regional variations in population density and distribution, and migration patterns influenced by differential mortality and economic opportunities. England's population did not recover to its pre-plague level of 4 to 6 million until sometime in the 16th century, approximately 200 years after the Black Death's initial arrival. This prolonged demographic stagnation resulted from recurring plague outbreaks that prevented sustained population growth and from changed reproductive patterns among survivors who may have delayed marriage or limited family size in time. Response to economic opportunities, social disruptions, or psychological impacts of mortality. The eventual demographic recovery during the 16th century created population pressure that contributed to various social phenomena, including increased vagrancy and poverty, pressure on agricultural resources, and rising food prices, expansion of urban populations and associated social problems, and eventually substantial emigration to colonial territories seeking land and economic opportunities unavailable in England. The Black Death's place in English historical development must be understood within the broader context of late medieval crisis, which included not only plague, but also climatic deterioration, agricultural failures, military conflicts, and political instabilities that collectively transformed European civilization. The 14th century witnessed the medieval warm period's end and the Little Ice Age's beginning, creating harsher climatic conditions that reduced agricultural productivity and contributed to famines, including the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. The Hundred Years' War between England and France, beginning in 1337, created military and fiscal pressures that intersected with plague's demographic and economic impacts. The Papal Schism beginning in 1378 divided Christian Europe between competing claimants to papal authority, undermining the Church's credibility and contributing to religious questioning and reform movements. These multiple crises interacted in complex ways, with plague mortality probably worsening economic consequences of agricultural failures, while military conflicts disrupted trade and spread disease through troop movements. The late medieval crisis, of which plague formed the most dramatic component, fundamentally transformed European society and created conditions that enabled the emergence of early modern states, economies, and cultural patterns. The comparative perspective on plague in England versus other European regions reveals both commonalities in epidemic patterns and distinctive features of the English experience. All European regions experienced devastating mortality during the Black Death's initial visitation, with death rates generally ranging from 30 to 60%, depending on local conditions. The recurring nature of plague throughout the late medieval and early modern periods characterized European demographic patterns more generally, rather than being unique to England. However, England's earlier cessation of plague after 1666, compared to major outbreaks continuing in continental Europe through the 18th century, represented a distinctive feature requiring explanation. The various proposed explanations, including housing improvements, rat species changes, quarantine effectiveness, and climatic factors, may all have contributed to England's escape from later plague, while other regions remained afflicted. The comparison between English plague experiences and patterns in Mediterranean regions, Central Europe, and Scandinavia reveals the importance of factors including population density, urbanization levels, maritime connectivity, housing types, and climate in shaping epidemic patterns. The relative importance of these various factors remains debated among historians and epidemiologists attempting to explain differential plague impacts across regions and time periods. The scientific study of historical plague using modern biomolecular techniques has revolutionized understanding of medieval epidemics by enabling direct identification of pathogens from historical burial sites and analysis of plague, bacteria genetic sequences, the extraction and sequencing of ancient DNA from teeth of Black Death victims buried in London's East Smithfield Emergency Plague Cemetery, confirmed that medieval plague was caused by Yersinia pestis and revealed genetic 14 characteristics of medieval plague strains. These paleogenomic studies demonstrated that medieval plague bacteria were ancestral to modern plague strains and identified specific genetic variations that may have influenced virulence or transmission efficiency. The reconstruction of complete plague bacterial genomes from medieval samples enabled comparison between historical and modern strains, revealing evolutionary changes in plague bacteria over centuries and providing insights into plague's natural history. The application of these molecular techniques to plague burial sites across Europe has revealed geographic variation in plague strains and identified multiple introductions of plague from Central Asian reservoirs, rather than continuous circulation of a single strain. These scientific advances have both confirmed historical accounts' basic accuracy regarding plague's devastating impact and provided biological mechanisms explaining patterns that historians had documented without understanding their underlying causes. The enduring relevance of England's Black Death history for contemporary society extends beyond historical interest to encompass practical lessons for pandemic preparedness, public health policy, and social resilience. The medieval and early modern experiences with recurring plague demonstrate the challenges of maintaining epidemic control over extended time periods and the importance of institutional capacity for implementing sustained public health measures. The social tensions generated by plague's economic consequences, particularly conflicts between labor and capital over wages and working conditions, resonate with contemporary debates about economic inequality and workers' rights during health crises. The role of governmental authority in disease control, including the balance between individual liberty and collective security, reflects ongoing tensions between personal freedom and public health that emerged during historical plague management. The importance of social support systems for individuals unable to work due to illness or quarantine, demonstrated by parish relief during plague periods, relates to contemporary discussions about social safety nets and governmental responsibility for population welfare. The communication challenges involved in managing public understanding and behavior during epidemics, evident in historical efforts to inform populations about plague while preventing panic, remain relevant to modern pandemic communication strategies. The commemoration of the Black Death in contemporary England through heritage sites, museums, educational programs, and popular culture maintains public awareness of this formative historical event while interpreting its significance for different audiences and purposes. The Museum of London's archaeological collections include artifacts and skeletal remains from plague burial sites that provide material evidence of the epidemic's impact. The East Smithfield Emergency Cemetery, excavated during the 1980s, yielded skeletal remains of plague victims whose bones show evidence of the rapid burial and mass mortality that characterized the Black Death. Educational programs about medieval plague use historical evidence to teach students about disease, social history, and historical methodology, while also drawing connections to contemporary health challenges. Popular histories and documentaries about the Black Death maintain public interest in medieval history, while sometimes sensationalizing or oversimplifying complex historical processes. The relevance of plague history surged during the COVID-19 pandemic as people sought historical parallels to contemporary epidemic experiences and lessons from past pandemic responses. The comparison between medieval plague and modern pandemics, while revealing some universal patterns in epidemic social impacts, also highlights distinctive features of each disease event and the importance of specific historical contexts in shaping epidemic experiences and outcomes. The Black Death's position in English national historical narrative reflects its undeniable significance as a demographic catastrophe and social transformation, while also being subject to various interpretative frameworks emphasizing different aspects of its legacy. Traditional historical accounts often emphasize the plague's role in ending feudalism and enabling England's transition to early modern social and economic patterns, an interpretation that perhaps overstated single-cause explanations while capturing important truths about the plague's transformative impacts. Social and economic historians have analyzed plague's effects on labor markets, agricultural practices, and commercial development, contributing to understanding of how demographic change influences economic structures and social relations. Cultural historians have examined plague's influence on art, literature, religion, and mentalities, revealing how epidemic experience shaped late medieval worldviews and cultural expression. Medical and epidemiological historians have investigated disease patterns, mortality rates, and the biological characteristics of plague bacteria, connecting historical evidence with modern scientific understanding of infectious disease. The synthesis of these various historical approaches has created increasingly sophisticated understanding of the Black Death's complex legacy and its multiple, interacting consequences for English society. The 3 centuries of recurring plague that England experienced from 1348 to 1666 represent a period of demographic instability and recurring crisis that fundamentally shaped the kingdom's development and created conditions enabling its emergence as a major European power. The plague's elimination after 1666, whether through natural ecological changes, improved public health measures, housing improvements, or some combination of factors, enabled sustained population growth that supported economic expansion and imperial development during the 18th and 19th centuries. The absence of plague during England's industrialization contrasts with the disease's continued presence in many other world regions and represents one of several favorable conditions that enabled England's economic and political ascendancy during the modern era. The complex legacy of the Black Death, operating through demographic, economic, social, cultural, religious, and political pathways, influenced virtually every aspect of English historical development from the late medieval period through early modernity and beyond. The epidemic's impact, while most dramatic in its immediate mortality and disruption, extended across centuries through its influence on social structures, economic patterns, cultural attitudes, and institutional developments that shaped England's trajectory as a nation. The study of this epochal event continues to yield new insights as historians apply new methodologies and draw connections between historical plague experiences and contemporary pandemic challenges, ensuring that the Black Death's place in English historical consciousness and scholarly investigation remains secure for future generations seeking to understand their nation's past and its continuing influence on the present. The epidemiological characteristics of plague, as it manifested in medieval and early modern England, revealed patterns that both contemporary observers and modern scholars have struggled to explain fully, with transmission dynamics shaped by complex interactions between human behavior, ecological conditions, bacterial genetics, and environmental factors that created distinctive outbreak patterns across different geographical regions and temporal periods. The disease's seasonal variation, with outbreaks typically beginning in spring or early summer and reaching peak intensity during warm months before declining in autumn and winter, reflected the temperature-dependent reproduction rates of flea vectors, whose activity increased in warmer conditions and decreased as temperatures dropped below thresholds necessary for flea survival and reproduction. Contemporary observers noted these seasonal patterns without understanding their biological basis, attributing summer plague peaks to various environmental factors, including the putrefaction of organic matter in heat, the concentration of harmful astrological influences, or divine providence manifesting judgment during specific calendar periods. The correlation between plague intensity and population density, with urban areas consistently experiencing higher attack rates and mortality than rural regions, reflected the increased opportunities for disease transmission in crowded conditions where human-rat flea contact occurred more frequently and where infected individuals encountered larger numbers of susceptible hosts. London's recurrent experience of severe plague outbreaks, compared to smaller towns and rural parishes that often escaped entirely or suffered limited mortality, demonstrated how urban concentration created persistent plague vulnerability that continued throughout the 3 centuries of England's plague history. The spatial diffusion of plague through English territory followed patterns determined by transportation networks, commercial relationships, and the movement of infected individuals or goods that carried plague bacteria from outbreak centres to previously unaffected areas. The diseases spread from port cities into inland regions, typically proceeded along major roads and waterways that facilitated commerce and communication, with market towns serving as secondary transmission nodes that distributed plague throughout their surrounding agricultural hinterlands. The hierarchical pattern of urban infection, whereby larger cities tended to experience outbreaks before smaller towns, reflected the more extensive commercial networks connecting major urban centres with each other and with continental ports where plague often originated. However, this hierarchical pattern was complicated by the role of coastal ports as potential independent introduction points where maritime trade brought plague directly from infected regions without necessarily passing through London or other major internal cities. The Norfolk and Suffolk coasts, with their extensive fishing industries and trade connections with Low Countries ports, experienced plague introductions that sometimes preceded or occurred independently of London outbreaks, creating multiple simultaneous epidemic foci rather than simple radial spread from a single centre. The persistence of plague, in particular localities over extended periods, with some parishes experiencing repeated outbreaks while neighbouring communities escaped infection, suggested the existence of local environmental or social factors that enhanced plague transmission or maintenance, though contemporary observers lacked the epidemiological concepts necessary to identify these factors systematically. The social patterning of plague mortality revealed differential risks across various population groups, defined by occupation, social class, age, gender, and residential location, with these patterns reflecting both biological susceptibilities and social behaviours that influence disease exposure and transmission. Occupational groups with extensive interpersonal contact or exposure to potentially infected materials, including healthcare workers, clergy, merchants, and those handling cloth and other textiles, experienced elevated mortality rates that reflected increased exposure to plague bacteria through their work activities. The clergy's particularly high death rates during plague outbreaks, repeatedly documented in ecclesiastical records from the Black Death through 17th century epidemics, resulted from their religious duties, attending sick and dying parishioners, and administering last rites that brought them into close contact with infected individuals at precisely the moments when disease transmission risk was highest. Healthcare personnel, including physicians, surgeons, apothecaries, and the women who served as nurses and midwives, similarly faced elevated risks through their care of plague patients, though their numbers and the documentation of their mortality remains less complete than clerical records. The differential mortality between wealthy and poor populations, while often assumed to favour the wealthy who could afford better nutrition, housing, and medical care, showed complex patterns that varied across different outbreak contexts and geographical settings. Wealthy individuals possessed advantages, including the ability to flee plague-affected areas and relocate to country estates, access to more spacious housing with fewer residents per dwelling, better nutrition that potentially enhanced immune resistance, and the resources to implement household quarantine measures that limited exposure to infected populations. However, these advantages did not guarantee survival, as numerous aristocratic and merchant families experienced plague deaths despite their wealth and social position. The age structure of plague mortality, which contemporary observers noted differed between the initial Black Death and subsequent recurrent outbreaks, reflected the immunological dynamics of epidemic disease in populations with varying prior exposure histories. The Black Death's initial appearance in a virgin soil population without previous plague exposure or immunity resulted in mortality distributed relatively evenly across all age groups, with infants, children, adults, and elderly individuals all experiencing high death rates. Subsequent plague outbreaks, occurring in populations where older individuals had survived previous epidemics and potentially developed some acquired immunity, showed shifted age distributions with disproportionate mortality among children and young adults who lacked prior exposure and therefore any protective immunity. The 1661 to 1662 outbreak, explicitly termed the children's pestilence by contemporary sources, exemplified this pattern by primarily affecting individuals born after the previous major epidemic who had never encountered plague bacteria and therefore possessed no acquired resistance. The biological mechanisms underlying this acquired immunity, which modern immunology explains through the development of antibody responses following initial infection, remained unknown to medieval and early modern observers, who nonetheless recognized the empirical pattern that plague survivors seemed less susceptible to subsequent infections. This observation contributed to practices including the employment of plague survivors as nurses and corpse handlers during epidemics, based on the accurate, if incompletely understood principle that prior infection provided some protection against reinfection. The gender dimensions of plague mortality remain contested among historians who have analyzed limited and sometimes contradictory evidence from various sources, including wills, parish registers, and manorial records that provide incomplete documentation of male and female deaths. Some studies have suggested higher female mortality during certain outbreaks, potentially related to women's traditional roles in household care of sick family members that increase their exposure to infected individuals, or to biological factors including pregnancy and childbirth that might have influenced susceptibility or disease severity. Other analyses have found roughly equivalent mortality rates between men and women, suggesting that plague's impact transcended gender in its demographic consequences. The evidence from monastic communities, where male monasteries and female convents can be analyzed separately, shows high mortality in both settings without consistent patterns favoring either sex, though the overall numbers of female religious were smaller and the documentation less complete than for male establishments. The social consequences of any differential mortality between sexes would have included impacts on marriage markets, household structures, and gender relations more broadly, though disentangling these effects from other plague consequences remains methodologically challenging given the complex interactions between demographic change and social patterns. The environmental factors influencing plague transmission included climatic conditions affecting flea populations and rat behavior, housing characteristics determining rodent access to human dwellings, and sanitation practices influencing rat population densities and human exposure to rodent waste and corpses. The correlation between plague outbreaks and preceding weather conditions, which some modern studies have identified through statistical analysis of historical climate records and plague mortality data, suggests that specific temperature and precipitation patterns created particularly favorable conditions for plague transmission by enhancing flea reproduction or increasing rat population densities. Warm springs following mild winters may have enabled early flea population growth and extended transmission seasons, while wet conditions could have influenced rat populations through effects on food supplies and shelter availability. However, the complexity of these ecological relationships and the limited precision of historical climate data make definitive conclusions about weather-plague relationships difficult to establish. The housing stock's evolution, from predominantly timber-framed construction with thatched roofs, which provided numerous opportunities for rats to nest in building structures, toward increased brick and tile construction following the Great Fire of London and other urban rebuilding episodes, may have contributed to reduced human-rat contact by creating more rat-resistant buildings. The gradual improvement in urban sanitation, including better waste disposal practices and reduced accumulation of organic refuse that supported rat populations, similarly may have contributed to declining plague transmission risk over the early modern period, though dramatic sanitation improvements did not occur until well after plague's disappearance from England. The economic consequences of plague extended beyond the immediate disruption of production and commerce during outbreak periods to include long-term structural changes in prices, wages, land values, and the organization of economic activities that reflected fundamental shifts in the relationship between population and resources. The wage increases that characterized the post-plague economy, beginning immediately after the Black Death and continuing, despite periodic setbacks throughout the late medieval period, reflected the basic economic principle that labor scarcity increases labor's price in market economies, where supply and demand influence compensation levels. The nominal wages paid to agricultural laborers, building craftsmen, and various urban workers increased by 50 to 100% in the decades following 1348, with these increases occurring despite governmental attempts to enforce wage controls and prevent workers from exploiting their enhanced bargaining position. The real wages of workers, accounting for changes in price levels of basic consumption goods, increased even more dramatically than nominal wages because agricultural prices declined due to reduced demand from the diminished population, creating a scissors effect whereby workers earned more money while the goods they purchased became cheaper. This combination of higher wages and lower prices enabled working-class standards of living to improve substantially during the century following the Black Death, with archaeological evidence from peasant dwellings and analysis of consumption patterns from probate inventories, confirming that common people enjoyed better housing, more varied diets, and increased possession of household goods compared to pre-plague generations. The land market's transformation following plague mortality reflected the sudden availability of holdings left vacant by deceased tenants, and the reduced demand for agricultural land from a diminished population that required less food production. The rental values of agricultural land declined sharply in the decades following the Black Death, with landlords forced to reduce rents by 30 to 50% or more to attract tenants for holdings that would have commanded higher rents before the demographic catastrophe. Some marginal agricultural land, which had been brought under cultivation during the population expansion of the 12th and 13th centuries, when land scarcity drove settlers to farm less productive soils, was abandoned entirely after the plague as cultivators concentrated their efforts on the most fertile holdings and left less rewarding lands to revert to pasture or waste. The contraction of cultivated acreage, documented through manorial records showing increased areas of uncultivated demesne land and abandoned tenant holdings, represented a rational economic response to changed demographic circumstances in which land abundance and labor scarcity made intensive cultivation of all available land uneconomic. The shift from arable to pastoral agriculture, which accelerated during the late medieval period, reflected landowners' adaptation to labor scarcity by converting grain fields to sheep pastures that required minimal labor input while producing valuable wool for domestic cloth manufacturing and export markets. This agricultural transformation had significant social consequences, including the displacement of agricultural laborers from land converted to pasture and the beginning of enclosure movements that would continue through the early modern period and fundamentally reshape the English rural landscape. The urban economy's response to plague combined immediate crisis management during outbreak periods with longer-term adaptations to change demographic and economic conditions that influenced craft organization, commercial practices, and urban development patterns. The craft guilds that controlled most urban manufacturing faced challenges maintaining their traditional structures and regulations in circumstances where master craftsmen died, leaving insufficient trained journeymen and apprentices to continue production, where consumer demand declined due to population reduction, but simultaneously shifted toward different types of goods, reflecting workers' increased purchasing power, and where labor scarcity enabled workers to challenge guild regulations restricting entry and controlling working conditions. Some guilds responded by relaxing entry requirements, reducing apprenticeship periods, and allowing widows of deceased masters to continue operating shops, adaptations that enabled production to continue despite personnel losses, but that also generated internal conflicts over standards and status. Other guilds attempted to maintain traditional restrictive practices despite changed circumstances, an approach that sometimes led to conflicts with non-guild producers and civic authorities concerned about maintaining adequate supplies of essential goods and services. The consolidation of related trades into fewer, Larger guilds reflected practical necessity in circumstances where individual crafts lacked sufficient practitioners to maintain viable independent organizations and economic benefits from combining related activities under unified activities. Governance structures. The commercial sector's recovery from plague disruption involved rebuilding trade networks, re-establishing credit relationships, and adapting to changed patterns of demand and supply that influenced what goods were produced and traded, and through which channels they moved. The wool trade, which formed the backbone of England's international commerce throughout the medieval period, experienced disruption during plague outbreaks, but recovered relatively quickly due to continental demand for English wool and the increasing domestic cloth manufacturing that processed wool into finished textiles. The shift from raw wool exports toward increased cloth exports, which characterized England's commercial development during the 14th and 15th centuries, reflected both the growth of domestic cloth manufacturing capacity and changing comparative advantages as English clothiers exploited abundant wool supplies and adopted new manufacturing techniques. The wine trade with Gascony, which had been a major component of England's medieval commerce, experienced permanent contraction following the Hundred Years' War's conclusion and the loss of English continental territories, though this decline reflected political changes rather than plague's direct effects. The rise of London as the dominant centre of English commerce, already evident before the plague, but accelerating in subsequent decades, reflected the capital's advantages in accessing international markets, attracting investment capital, and providing the commercial infrastructure necessary for sophisticated trading operations. The fiscal impact of plague on royal government revealed itself through reduced tax revenues from a diminished taxpayer base, increased expenditures for emergency measures and relief activities, and the political challenges of extracting adequate resources from populations experiencing their own economic pressures and increasingly resistant to traditional fiscal demands. The parliamentary taxation that formed the Crown's primary revenue source beyond traditional royal demesne income required consent from representatives of counties and boroughs, who proved increasingly reluctant to grant taxes in circumstances where their constituents faced economic difficulties and questioned the necessity of royal expenditures. The experiments with poll taxes during the late 14th century, including the graduated poll tax of 1377 and the flat-rate poll taxes of 1379 and 1380, that contributed to the peasants' revolt, reflected the Crown's attempts to develop new taxation methods that would generate adequate revenue from a reduced population base. The widespread resistance these taxes encountered, culminating in the 1381 uprising, demonstrated the political limits of fiscal innovation and the risks of implementing taxation systems that populations perceived as unjust or excessively burdensome. The royal household's economies and administrative reforms during the later 14th and 15th centuries partly reflected fiscal pressures created by plague's demographic and economic consequences, though distinguishing these effects from other influences on governmental development remains methodologically complex. The military implications of plague-related demographic decline included challenges recruiting adequate military forces, difficulties maintaining long-term military campaigns when epidemic disease struck armies in the field or disrupted logistical support, and changing military technologies and tactics that reflected both population pressures and broader developments in European warfare. The English armies that fought in France during the Hundred Years' War drew manpower from a population substantially reduced by plague mortality, potentially limiting the Crown's ability to field large forces for extended periods and contributing to the eventual English defeat and loss of continental territories. The plague outbreaks that periodically affected military forces in the field, including instances where epidemic disease forced the abandonment of sieges or military campaigns, demonstrated disease's continuing importance as a factor in military success or failure, alongside battlefield capabilities and strategic planning. The development of longbow tactics that gave English armies significant advantages in 14th century battles may have reflected responses to manpower constraints that made infantry forces relatively more valuable than heavily armoured cavalry requiring extensive resources to maintain. However, Establishing direct causal connections between plague demographic impacts and military developments remains speculative, given the multiple factors influencing military change and the difficulty of isolating plague's specific effects from other demographic, economic, and technological influences on warfare. The psychological and cultural responses to living with recurring plague revealed themselves through various behaviors, beliefs, and practices that reflected individuals' and communities' attempts to understand, prevent, or cope with epidemic disease and its traumatic consequences. The prevalence of memento mori imagery in late medieval art, including painted and sculpted representations of death, decomposition, and the transience of earthly life, reflected plague-era preoccupations with mortality and the need to maintain spiritual preparation for death's potentially sudden arrival. The popularity of the dance macabre motif, showing death-leading representatives of all social orders in a dance toward the grave, expressed both the universality of mortality that plague so dramatically demonstrated and a certain dark humor in confronting death's inevitability through artistic representation. The proliferation of testamentary bequests for prayers and masses for the dead, creating a vast economy of intercession that employed significant clerical personnel and consumed substantial resources, demonstrated the anxiety about post-mortem fate and the desire to ensure adequate spiritual preparation through purchased prayers that might reduce purgatorial suffering. The development of detailed Ars Moriendi literature, instructional texts teaching proper methods for dying well and avoiding spiritual pitfalls during death's final moments, reflected both the clergy's pastoral response to widespread mortality and lay anxiety about managing death's spiritual challenges successfully. The community-level responses to plague combined practical measures for managing epidemic emergencies with religious and ceremonial activities intended to secure divine protection or mercy and social practices that maintained collective solidarity despite mortality's disruptive impacts. The organization of community processions, public prayers, and special religious services during plague outbreaks expressed collective appeals for divine intervention, while also serving social functions in demonstrating community, unity, and shared purpose in confronting common threats. The establishment of plague regulations governing the marking of infected houses, the burial of victims, the movement of goods and people, and various other matters reflected communities' attempts to implement control measures based on empirical observations about disease spread, even when the underlying transmission mechanisms remained unknown. The charitable activities that provided relief for plague victims and their families, organized through parishes, religious guilds, and various voluntary associations, demonstrated communities' commitment to mutual assistance despite the fears and self-protective impulses that epidemic conditions naturally generated. The tensions between community solidarity and individual self-preservation, evident in instances of flight from plague-affected areas, abandonment of sick family members, and the breakdown of normal social obligations under epidemic pressures, revealed the psychological strains that extreme mortality created and the sometimes fragile nature of social bonds when confronted with existential threats. The long-term demographic patterns that emerged from recurring plague cycles included not only the overall population decline and delayed recovery, discussed previously, but also potential changes in age structure, household composition, life expectancy, and demographic behaviors, including marriage, age, and fertility, that reflected both biological consequences of epidemic disease and social adaptations to changed mortality regimes. The increase in the proportion of elderly individuals in the immediate post-plague population, resulting from plague's tendency to kill adults and children, while sometimes sparing the elderly, who may have possessed immunity from earlier exposures, created temporary demographic imbalances that affected dependency ratios and potentially influenced cultural attitudes toward aging and intergenerational relationships. The disruption of family structures through the deaths of parents, spouses, and children created significant numbers of orphans, widows, and widowers whose presence in communities necessitated social mechanisms for their support and integration into existing household structures through remarriage, adoption, or incorporation into extended family arrangements. The apparent increase in household complexity during the late medieval period, with more evidence of extended family households and less prevalence of simple nuclear family structures compared to earlier and later periods, may have reflected adaptive responses to plague mortality that made extended family support networks more necessary for survival and household viability. The epidemiological transition from recurring plague cycles to the disease's eventual disappearance from England after 1666 represented one of the most significant but least understood developments in the public's nation's disease history, with explanations remaining speculative and contested among historians and epidemiologists who have proposed various mechanisms potentially contributing to plague's elimination. The brown rat displacement hypothesis, which suggests that the gradual replacement of the black rat by the brown rat altered the ecological conditions necessary for plague transmission to humans, rests on the behavioral differences between these species, with brown rats less likely to inhabit human dwellings and therefore less likely to bring their infected fleas into close contact with human populations. However, the evidence for the timing of brown rat arrival in England and the extent of its displacement of black rats during the critical period remains uncertain, with some authorities questioning whether brown rats had established significant English populations before the 18th century, well after plague's disappearance. The housing improvement hypothesis proposes that changes in building construction, particularly increased use of brick and tile in place of timber and thatch, following London's Great Fire and broader rebuilding trends, created structures less accessible to rats and therefore reduced opportunities for the human-rat flea contact necessary for plague transmission. This explanation has plausibility, given the physical barriers that solid brick walls and tile roofs created against rodent entry compared to the more permeable traditional construction methods. Though whether these improvements occurred quickly enough or extensively enough to explain plague's complete disappearance remains debatable. The quarantine effectiveness hypothesis suggests that improved maritime health controls and quarantine practices prevented plague-infected ships from introducing the disease from continental European ports, where plague continued to circulate, or contained any introductions that occurred before they could establish local transmission chains. The development of more systematic quarantine procedures during the 17th century, including the establishment of dedicated quarantine facilities for ships arriving from infected ports and improved surveillance of maritime traffic, potentially reduced the probability of successful plague introduction, even as the disease remained epidemic in other regions. However, this explanation requires that quarantine measures reach sufficient effectiveness to prevent any successful introduction over the extended period, from 1666 through the 18th century, despite continuing European plague and extensive maritime trade between England and affected regions. A level of border control efficiency that seems questionable given the technology and administrative capabilities of the period. The immunity development hypothesis proposes that generations of plague exposure had selected for genetic resistance in the English population, or that acquired immunity from childhood exposures provided sufficient protection to prevent epidemic transmission, even when plague bacteria were introduced, though this explanation struggles to account for the continuing vulnerability of continental European populations that had experienced similar selection pressures and exposure histories. The bacterial evolution hypothesis suggests that changes in Yersinia pestis itself, including possible evolution toward reduced virulence or altered transmission characteristics, may have contributed to plague's declining epidemic potential, though modern genetic analysis of plague strains from different historical periods has not identified dramatic genetic changes that would obviously explain altered epidemiological behavior. The climate change hypothesis relates plague's disappearance to the Little Ice Age's peak during the 17th century, proposing that cooling temperatures affected either flea biology, rat behavior, or the interaction between these factors in ways that reduced plague transmission efficiency below the threshold necessary for sustained epidemic spread. The correlation between plague's gradual decline in Northern Europe and the period of maximum cooling during the 1650s through 1690s provides temporal plausibility for this explanation. though the mechanisms through which climate change would specifically affect plague, while not preventing other flea-borne diseases or rodent-associated infections, remain unclear. The synthetic explanation, acknowledging that multiple factors probably contributed to plague's elimination rather than any single cause operating in isolation, seems most consistent with the complexity of disease ecology and the various changes occurring in 17th century England, including demographic shifts, economic transformations, housing improvements, public health developments, and environmental changes that collectively created conditions less favorable for plague transmission. The inability to definitively resolve this historical question reflects both the limitations of available evidence from the period and the complexity of disease systems, whose behavior emerges from interactions among hosts, pathogens, vectors, and environments in ways that simple monocausal explanations cannot adequately capture. The commemoration and historical memory of plague in English culture evolved through successive generations, as direct experience gave way to historical consciousness, and as changing concerns and interpretative frameworks shaped how past epidemics were understood and their significance assessed. The immediate post-plague period witnessed numerous memorials and remembrances, including the establishment of special religious services, the dedication of churches and chapels to plague saints, and the preservation of burial sites as consecrated ground with particular spiritual significance. The parish registers that documented plague mortality served as continuing reminders of epidemic losses, with their statistical evidence of catastrophic death rates available to subsequent generations examining historical records. The physical landscape bore plague's imprint through abandoned settlements, converted agricultural land, and the occasional rediscovery of mass burial grounds during construction activities that revealed the material evidence of epidemic mortality. The literary treatments of plague, from contemporary chronicle accounts, through later historical narratives, and eventually fictional reconstructions, shaped cultural memory by selecting certain aspects of the epidemic experience for emphasis while neglecting others, creating simplified narratives that rendered complex historical processes into more comprehensible and emotionally resonant stories. The 19th and 20th centuries witnessed scholarly rehabilitation of plague history through the development of professional history and demographic analysis that approached past epidemics as subjects for systematic investigation, using archival research, statistical methods, and eventually interdisciplinary collaboration with scientists who could illuminate disease biology and transmission dynamics. The application of demographic reconstruction techniques to parish registers and other historical records enabled quantitative estimates of mortality levels and analysis of epidemic patterns with greater precision than contemporary observers had achieved. The development of economic history as a distinct subfield created opportunities for analyzing plague's economic consequences and its role in late medieval and early modern economic transformations, generating interpretations that emphasized either revolutionary change or underlying continuities, depending on scholars' theoretical perspectives and evidentiary emphases. The social history movement's attention to ordinary people's experiences, rather than exclusively elite activities, created interest in plague's impact on common people and the social dynamics of epidemic communities, producing microhistorical studies of particular parishes or localities that revealed the individual human dimensions of epidemic mortality alongside broader demographic and economic patterns. The medical and scientific investigation of historical plague accelerated during the late 20th and early 21st centuries through the application of emerging biomolecular techniques, including ancient DNA extraction, sequencing that enabled direct identification of pathogens from archaeological remains, and genetic analysis, revealing evolutionary relationships between historical and modern plague strains. These scientific advances confirmed the biological basis of historical plague epidemics that some scholars had questioned, resolved debates about whether Black Death was bubonic plague or some other disease, and provided insights into plague bacteria's evolution and the genetic diversity of strains circulating during different historical periods. The paleogenomic studies that reconstructed complete plague bacterial genomes from medieval teeth represented remarkable technical achievements that demonstrated both the preservation potential of ancient DNA under favorable conditions and the insights that genetic analysis could provide about historical disease organisms. The integration of historical and scientific evidence in interdisciplinary plague studies exemplified productive collaboration between humanistic and scientific approaches to understanding past events, with each methodology contributing distinct types of evidence and interpretative insights that generated more comprehensive understandings than either approach alone could achieve. The contemporary relevance of England's plague history gained renewed salience during the COVID-19 pandemic, as people sought historical precedents for understanding epidemic impacts on societies, economies, and individuals, while drawing lessons about pandemic response from past experiences with epidemic disease. The comparisons between medieval plague and modern pandemics, while revealing some universal patterns in epidemic social effects, including the disruption of normal activities, the strain on healthcare systems and mortality management, the economic consequences of reduced commerce and labor force impacts, and the social tensions generated by control measures that restricted individual liberty, also highlighted significant differences between disease events separated by centuries of medical advancement, economic development, and institutional change. The modern capacity for rapid pathogen identification, epidemiological surveillance, international coordination, and medical intervention created possibilities for pandemic response that medieval and early modern authorities could not have imagined. Yet the social and economic challenges of managing epidemic disease revealed continuities in human vulnerability to infectious threats despite technological progress. The historical study of plague responses, including both successes in limiting transmission through practical measures like quarantine and failures resulting from inadequate understanding of disease causation or implementation of ineffective or harmful interventions, offered cautionary lessons about the importance of evidence-based public health practice and the risks of responding to epidemic disease through panic, misinformation, or politically motivated policies that contradict scientific evidence. The Black Death's ultimate legacy in English history transcends its immediate demographic catastrophe to encompass its role as a transformative event that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the nation's social, economic, cultural, and political development. The epidemic's destruction of approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of England's population created a demographic crisis whose consequences shaped English society for centuries as the kingdom adapted to changed relationships between population, resources, labor, and social organization. The enhanced bargaining position of surviving workers and the erosion of feudal labor obligations contributed to England's relatively early transition toward wage labor and market-oriented economic relationships that some historians have identified as preconditions for later capitalist development and industrial transformation. The social mobility enabled by mortality-created vacancies in various occupational and social positions contributed to increased fluidity in status hierarchies and potentially enhanced opportunity for advancement based on ability, achievement rather than inherited position. The cultural and religious developments of the late medieval period, including vernacular spirituality's growth, questioning of clerical authority, and emphasis on personal religious experience, reflected both the plague's disruption of traditional religious institutions and its psychological impact on survivors confronting mortality's omnipresence. The evolution of English governance toward increased administrative capacity, public health regulation, and social welfare provision reflected lessons learned through managing recurring plague crises and addressing their social consequences. The centuries of recurring plague that England experienced from 1348 through 1666 constituted one of the most significant epidemiological and historical phenomena in the nation's long history. An experience that tested English society's resilience, catalyzed transformative changes across multiple domains, and ultimately contributed to shaping the kingdom that would emerge as a major power during the early modern and modern periods. The study of this plague history continues to yield insights relevant not only for understanding England's past, but also for addressing contemporary challenges related to epidemic disease, social inequality, economic transformation, and institutional development, ensuring that the Black Death's memory and its lessons remain vital components of England's historical consciousness and its ongoing engagement with questions about society, health, and collective welfare that resonate across the centuries, separating medieval plague from modern concerns. The architectural and urban planning responses to plague throughout England's 3 centuries of epidemic experience demonstrated evolving understanding of disease transmission and changing priorities in creating healthier urban environments. Though these developments proceeded gradually and unevenly across different cities and time periods, with substantial variation in both the sophistication of interventions and their actual effectiveness in reducing disease transmission. The medieval urban landscape that preceded the Black Death's arrival had developed organically over centuries, with minimal planning or regulation, resulting in densely packed timber-framed buildings arranged along narrow, winding streets that facilitated neither traffic flow nor adequate sanitation, creating conditions that modern observers recognize as ideal for disease transmission, though contemporary inhabitants viewed them as normal features of urban life. The typical medieval urban dwelling consisted of timber frame construction, with wattle and daub infill walls and thatched roofs, structures that provided numerous entry points and nesting locations for rats, whose presence in buildings went largely unnoticed until rodent populations reached levels that created obvious problems through food consumption, structural damage, or the accumulation of droppings and corpses. The vertical organization of urban buildings, with commercial activities on ground floors and residential spaces on upper levels, concentrated human populations in areas directly above shops and workshops, where goods stored in warehouses and storerooms attracted rodent populations seeking food sources, creating spatial overlap between human and rat habitats that facilitated the flea-mediated transmission connecting these populations. The sanitation systems of medieval English cities, relying primarily on cesspits for waste disposal and open drainage channels for surface water and liquid waste, created environmental conditions that supported large rat populations, while also generating the foul odors and visible filth that contemporary observers associated with disease causation through miasmatic theory. The cesspits, which required periodic emptying by gongfermors, who removed accumulated waste for disposal outside city walls or sale to farmers as fertilizer, frequently leaked into surrounding soil and contaminated water sources, creating public health hazards beyond their role in supporting rat populations. The drainage channels that ran along streets or through properties, often uncovered and subject to blockage by accumulated debris, created standing water and concentrated organic waste that attracted rats and other vermin, while generating the putrid smells that medieval residents associated with unhealthy air. The absence of comprehensive water supply systems meant that most urban residents obtained water from wells, rivers, or public conduits that were vulnerable to contamination from nearby cesspits and waste disposal, creating risks for waterborne diseases alongside the plague transmission occurring through rat-flea-human pathways. The efforts to address these sanitation problems through municipal regulations, including ordinances requiring property owners to maintain drainage channels, prohibiting the disposal of waste in streets, and establishing public facilities for waste collection, demonstrated authorities' recognition that urban cleanliness related to health, even when the specific mechanisms remained unknown. The post-plague period witnessed increased attention to urban planning and public health. Though the implementation of improvements proceeded slowly due to the enormous costs involved in infrastructure development, the complexity of coordinating improvements across properties with diverse ownership, and the resistance from residents reluctant to bear the financial burdens or disruptions associated with urban reconstruction, the wider streets and more regular building plots that appeared in some reconstructed areas after major fires or planned expansions represented improvements over medieval layouts, facilitating both traffic movement and firefighting efforts, while potentially reducing the density of human occupation that had characterized earlier urban development. The gradual transition from timber to brick construction, accelerated by fire regulations that prohibited or restricted timber building in urban cores after major conflagrations, created more durable and potentially more rat-resistant structures, though the actual impact on rodent populations depended on construction quality and maintenance practices that varied considerably across different buildings and neighborhoods. The development of piped water supply systems, beginning with public conduits that brought water from distant springs to urban distribution points, and eventually expanding to include household connections in wealthy neighborhoods, improved access to cleaner water while reducing reliance on potentially contaminated wells, though comprehensive water supply systems remained limited to major cities and did not reach most urban residents until well into the modern period. The pest houses that authorities established during plague outbreaks represented specialized facilities designed to isolate infected individuals away from general populations, creating institutional responses to epidemic disease that acknowledged transmission through human contact, even when the specific mechanisms remained unknown. The establishment of pest houses proceeded gradually across English cities during the 16th and 17th centuries, with London's first dedicated plague hospital opening in the 1560s, followed by similar facilities in other major towns, as plague recurrence made temporary isolation measures increasingly inadequate. The pest houses typically occupied locations on urban peripheries, distanced from residential neighborhoods, to minimize contact between plague patients and healthy populations, while remaining accessible enough for the transport of patients and the delivery of supplies. The architectural design of pest houses emphasized segregation and containment, with separate wards for different patient categories, controlled entry and exit procedures, and physical barriers limiting movement between facility sections. The staffing of pest houses presented persistent challenges, as few individuals willingly accepted positions requiring daily contact with plague patients, despite the relatively high wages offered for these dangerous duties, with positions often filled by plague survivors who possessed some immunity from previous infection, or by desperate individuals lacking alternative employment options. The medical care provided in pest houses remained limited, given the ineffectiveness of available plague treatments, with nursing staff primarily offering palliative care, maintaining patient hygiene, and organizing the removal and burial of those who died, tasks that required significant labor and resources, but had minimal impact on survival rates. The quarantine practices that authorities implemented with increasing systematization during the 16th and 17th centuries represented attempts to limit plague transmission by isolating infected households and restricting the movement of people and goods from plague-affected areas, creating early public health interventions that acknowledged disease transmission through human contact and contaminated materials, even when the underlying mechanisms remained misunderstood. The household quarantine system, that became standard practice in English cities by the late 16th century, required the confinement of all household members when plague was diagnosed in any resident, with the house marked by red crosses or written warnings and guards posted to prevent unauthorized exits. The duration of quarantine, typically 40 days following the last death or recovery in the household, reflected traditional quarantine periods derived from biblical precedents rather than empirical observation of plague's natural history, though this duration probably exceeded the actual period during which household members remained infectious and therefore provided adequate time for disease resolution. The relief payments provided to quarantined households, funded through parish rates and administered by local officials, represented recognition that families prevented from working required financial support to purchase food and other necessities, creating early forms of state-supported social welfare justified by public health necessity. The practical implementation of household quarantine generated significant resistance from affected families who viewed confinement with sick relatives as virtual death sentences, and from neighbors and merchants concerned about the economic disruptions and social stigma associated with marked houses in their vicinity. The port quarantine measures that authorities attempted to implement for ships arriving from plague-affected regions faced even greater challenges than household quarantine due to the commercial pressures to expedite cargo unloading and the practical difficulties of maintaining ship crews in isolation for extended periods while determining whether vessels carried infection. The quarantine regulations that Parliament enacted during 17th century plague outbreaks required ships arriving from infected ports to anchor offshore for 40 days before obtaining pratique to enter port and unload cargo, a period during which crews remained aboard while health officials observed for any signs of disease. The economic costs of 40-day ship delays created powerful incentives for evasion through bribery of officials, provision of false information about ports of origin, or illegal unloading at isolated coastal locations where surveillance was limited and enforcement difficult. The establishment of quarantine facilities on offshore islands or at isolated coastal locations, where ships could discharge cargo for fumigation, and crew members could reside during observation periods, represented attempts to reduce quarantine's economic impact while maintaining disease surveillance. Though these facilities required substantial infrastructure investments and operating costs that limited their geographic distribution, the fumigation of goods and ships using smoke from burning aromatic woods, sulfur, or other materials believed to purify corrupted air reflected miasmatic theory's influence on quarantine practice, creating procedures that probably had minimal actual effect on plague transmission, but satisfied contemporary understanding of how disease prevention should operate. The plague orders that civic authorities issued during outbreaks codified various regulations governing behavior and commercial activities during epidemic emergencies, creating comprehensive frameworks for disease management that encompassed household quarantine, pest house operation, burial practices, market regulation, and numerous other matters. The orders typically included provisions requiring the reporting of suspected plague cases to civic authorities, enabling surveillance systems that tracked epidemic spread and targeted control measures toward affected neighborhoods. The regulations governing the movement and employment of plague survivors, who were often required to carry certificates confirming their recovery and eligibility for unrestricted movement, created early forms of health documentation that enabled authorities to distinguish between quarantine evaders and legitimate travelers, while also facilitating the employment of recovered individuals in plague-related work where their immunity made them valuable. The restrictions on public gatherings during plague outbreaks, including closure of theaters, prohibition of markets and fairs, and cancellation of religious processions, reflected recognition that disease transmission occurred through human contact, and that limiting crowd assembly could reduce epidemic spread. Though these measures created significant economic and social disruptions that authorities implemented reluctantly and lifted as quickly as outbreak conditions permitted. The requirement that plague victims be buried quickly and in designated burial grounds, often with prohibitions on traditional funeral ceremonies and restrictions on the number of attendees, generated resistance from families seeking to honor their dead through customary practices, but reflected practical necessity, given the rapid accumulation of corpses during severe outbreaks and the limitations of available burial space. The mortality surveillance systems that developed in London during the 16th century through the publication of weekly bills of mortality created unprecedented documentation of urban death patterns and provided authorities with information enabling them to track epidemic spread and assess the effectiveness of control measures, though the accuracy and completeness of these records remained limited by various factors, including incomplete coverage of suburban parishes, potential underreporting of plague deaths to avoid quarantine and stigma, and the diagnostic uncertainties that made distinguishing plague from other causes of death difficult, given the limited medical knowledge of the period. The bills of mortality originated in parish clerks' efforts to document baptisms and burials for record-keeping purposes, with compilation and publication becoming more systematic during the 16th century as authorities recognized their utility for plague surveillance. The appointed searchers, typically older women, familiar with disease symptoms and signs of death, examined corpses and determined causes of death that were recorded in parish registers and compiled into weekly summaries, published as broadsheets and posted in public locations. The categories of death recorded in bills of mortality included not only plague, but numerous other causes ranging from specific diseases to vague descriptive terms like suddenly or grief, creating mortality, records that provided rich information about urban health patterns, while also reflecting contemporary medical understanding and classification systems that differed substantially from modern nosology. The publication of bills of mortality created public awareness of epidemic trends that influenced individual decisions about remaining in London or fleeing to safer locations, with wealthy residents often monitoring weekly death tolls and evacuating when numbers exceeded thresholds they considered acceptable risks. The flight of wealthy urbanites to country estates during plague outbreaks represented rational responses to epidemic risk, given the higher urban mortality rates and the correlation between population density and disease transmission. Though this behavior generated social criticism from those unable to afford evacuation and created practical problems when civic leaders and officials abandoned their posts during emergencies, requiring coordinated responses. The seasonal migration patterns that developed among wealthy Londoners, who maintained both urban townhouses and rural estates, and alternated residence between them based on plague conditions, social seasons, and business requirements, created a geographic mobility among elites that contrasted sharply with the immobility of poor residents lacking resources for relocation and dependent on urban employment for survival. The literature satirizing flight from plague, including works by Thomas Dekker and other writers who criticized wealthy evacuees for abandoning social obligations and fleeing danger, while poor residents remained to face epidemic mortality, reflected class tensions and competing moral frameworks regarding individual self-preservation versus collective responsibility. The practical consequences of elite flight included the disruption of governance when officials evacuated, the collapse of charitable relief when wealthy benefactors departed, and the concentration of epidemic mortality among poor populations unable to escape, creating patterns of differential mortality that reflected and reinforced social inequalities. The medical marketplace during plague outbreaks expanded dramatically as desperate populations sought treatments and preventatives from physicians, surgeons, apothecaries, and various irregular practitioners offering services ranging from standard learned medicine to outright quackery, creating commercial opportunities for healthcare providers, while also generating fraud and exploitation as unscrupulous practitioners profited from public desperation. The learned physicians whose practices focused on wealthy patients and whose treatments derived from humoral theory and classical medical texts typically evacuated cities during severe plague outbreaks, leaving care of the sick primarily to surgeons, apothecaries, and irregular practitioners whose services were more affordable and accessible to common people. The plague doctors, employed by civic authorities to provide care for poor plague victims, operated under contracts specifying their duties and compensation while requiring them to remain in the city during outbreaks, creating medical positions that offered high pay to compensate for the substantial risks, but often attracted practitioners of questionable competence who lacked more desirable employment. The distinctive costume associated with plague doctors, including the beaked mask containing aromatic substances intended to filter corrupted air, the long waxed coat providing barrier protection, and the wooden stick enabling examination of patients without direct contact, reflected both contemporary theories about plague transmission through poisoned air and practical attempts to limit exposure to disease through physical barriers and olfactory protection. The medicaments marketed for plague prevention and treatment included a vast array of substances ranging from traditional remedies with ancient pedigrees to novel preparations advertised as miraculous discoveries, with formulations incorporating ingredients from plants, animals, minerals, and various exotic materials believed to possess special potency against plague. The theriac, or Venice treacle, a complex compound containing dozens of ingredients including snake flesh, opium, and numerous herbs and spices, represented the most prestigious and expensive plague remedy, whose ancient origins and complicated preparation process conveyed authority and effectiveness to contemporary consumers, despite its probable lack of actual therapeutic value. The plague waters, cordials, and elixirs sold by apothecaries and traveling medicine vendors contained varying combinations of alcohol, herbs, spices, and other ingredients claimed to strengthen the body's resistance to plague or cure early infections, creating a commercial market for preventative medicine that reflected both legitimate health concerns and the entrepreneurial opportunities presented by public fear. The amulets and charms marketed for plague protection, including rings containing supposedly efficacious stones, sachets filled with aromatic herbs, and written prayers or magical formulas, reflected the integration of medical and religious or magical approaches to disease prevention. that characterized early modern popular culture and created additional commercial opportunities for those willing to supply products meeting these diverse demands. The religious interpretations of plague that emphasized divine punishment for human sinfulness coexisted uneasily with naturalistic medical explanations, focusing on corrupted air and humoral imbalances, creating theological and intellectual tensions that authorities managed through frameworks, acknowledging both supernatural causation and natural mechanisms operating as instruments of divine will. The sermons preached during plague outbreaks typically emphasize both the need for spiritual repentance to address plague's ultimate divine causes and the importance of implementing practical measures like quarantine and sanitation that might limit epidemics spread through natural mechanisms, creating synthetic approaches that satisfied both religious and practical concerns. The fast days and prayer services that authorities organized during epidemics served multiple functions, including appeasing divine wrath through collective displays of piety, maintaining social order through organized religious observance, and providing psychological comfort to frightened populations seeking supernatural protection alongside practical disease prevention measures. The theological debates about whether fleeing plague represented sinful lack of faith in divine protection or prudent use of God-given reason to avoid unnecessary danger generated extensive discussion among clergy and educated laity, with most religious authorities eventually endorsing flight as legitimate, particularly for those with dependent family members whose welfare required preservation of household heads, though remaining to serve the sick was praised as particularly virtuous self-sacrifice. The impact of plague on parish life and religious practice extended beyond immediate disruptions during outbreaks to influence long-term developments in English Christianity, including the growth of lay religious activity, changing attitudes toward death and the afterlife, and evolving relationships between clergy and laity. The clergy shortages created by plague mortality necessitated greater lay participation in religious activities, including the organization of charitable relief, maintenance of church buildings, and even administration of certain sacraments in emergency situations, creating precedents for lay religious authority that would influence later developments in English Protestantism. The increased emphasis on preparing for death through proper spiritual exercises, charitable bequests, and arrangements for post-mortem prayers reflected plague's reinforcement of mortality's omnipresence and the importance of maintaining constant readiness for death's potentially sudden arrival. The chantry chapels and prayers for the dead that proliferated during and after plague periods created substantial demand for clerical services and generated significant ecclesiastical revenues, while also reflecting popular concerns about purgatory and the efficacy of prayers and masses in reducing post-mortem suffering. The Protestant Reformation's rejection of prayers for the dead and elimination of purgatory as theological concepts represented radical departures from the plague-era religious culture that had emphasized post-mortem intercession, creating religious changes that reflected multiple causes, but that occurred in societies whose religious practices had been profoundly shaped by centuries of plague experience. The educational disruptions caused by plague mortality and the periodic closures of schools and universities during outbreaks affected knowledge transmission and intellectual development in ways that remain difficult to quantify, but that clearly influenced the careers of individual scholars and the institutional development of educational institutions. The universities at Oxford and Cambridge experienced significant mortality during plague outbreaks, with college communities suffering from the concentrated populations and close quarters that facilitated disease transmission, leading to temporary closures and evacuations that interrupted teaching and research. The grammar schools and other educational institutions that prepared students for university study or provided basic literacy and numeracy training for merchants and craftsmen similarly experienced disruptions during plague periods, with schools closing and teachers dying or fleeing, creating gaps in education for cohorts of students whose learning was interrupted by epidemic emergencies. The long-term consequences of these educational disruptions for English intellectual life remain uncertain, though the delays in completing university degrees, the interruptions in scholarly networks and collaborative projects, and the loss of accumulated knowledge when scholars died before transmitting their expertise to students, probably had some impact on the pace and direction of intellectual development. The recovery of educational institutions after plague outbreaks through the recruitment of new teachers, the resumption of normal instruction, and the graduation of delayed students eventually restored educational functions, though the quality of instruction and the loss of specialized knowledge during transition periods may have affected educational outcomes in ways that contributed to concerns about declining standards that periodically emerged in discussions of late medieval and early modern education. The artistic and literary responses to plague encompassed wide-ranging creative productions that reflected the epidemic's psychological and social impacts, while also shaping cultural memory and influencing how subsequent generations understood the plague experience. The visual arts produced during and after plague periods often incorporated memento mori imagery, including skulls, skeletons, hourglasses, and other symbols of mortality's inevitability, creating artistic programs in churches, private chapels, and illustrated manuscripts that reminded viewers of death's constant presence and the importance of spiritual preparation. The tomb monuments that became increasingly elaborate during the late medieval period sometimes incorporated transi or cadaver tombs, showing decomposing corpses beneath effigies of the deceased in life, creating powerful visual contrasts between earthly glory and post-mortem decay that reinforced messages about the transience of worldly status and the universal leveling power of death. The danse macabre paintings and prints that appeared in churches and public spaces showed personified death, leading representatives of all social orders in a dance toward the grave, creating allegorical representations of mortality's democratic reach that resonated with plague survivors who had witnessed death's apparent disregard for social hierarchies. The religious art of the period increasingly emphasized Christ's suffering and death, the torments of hell and purgatory, and the intercession of saints, reflecting theological emphases shaped by plague-era concerns about divine judgment, post-mortem fate, and the efficacy of supernatural assistance. The literary productions of the late medieval and early modern periods reflected plague's influence through various genres and themes, including chronicles documenting epidemic events, moral and didactic works interpreting plague's meanings, devotional literature emphasizing preparation for death, and fictional narratives incorporating plague into their plots or using epidemic as metaphor for social disorder. The chronicle accounts of plague outbreaks, written by contemporary observers, including monastic chroniclers, urban officials, and literate laypeople, provided detailed descriptions of epidemic progression, mortality levels, social disruptions, and religious responses, creating source materials that continue to inform historical understanding of plague's impacts, while also revealing contemporary frameworks for understanding disease and its significance. The moral interpretation of plague as divine punishment appeared repeatedly in religious literature that emphasized the need for repentance and spiritual reform, while the social criticism embedded in some plague writings questioned whether God's judgment fell appropriately on sinners or randomly afflicted innocent and guilty alike, creating theological tensions that generated extensive discussion. The Ars Moriendi literature that taught proper methods for dying well reflected plague-era concerns about managing death's spiritual challenges successfully, providing detailed guidance about resisting temptations, making appropriate confessions, and maintaining proper mental states during death's final moments. The fictional incorporation of plague into literary narratives, though less common in medieval and early modern English literature than might be expected given plague's prominence in lived experience, appeared in works that used epidemic as plot device, explored plague's psychological impacts, or employed disease as metaphor for moral corruption and social disorder. The economic historians' debates about plague's role in late medieval economic transformation have generated extensive scholarship, examining relationships between demographic decline and changes in prices, wages, land values, agricultural practices, commercial organization, and technological innovation, with interpretations ranging from emphasis on plague's revolutionary impacts to arguments stressing continuities with pre-plague patterns and the importance of non-demographic factors in economic change. The traditional interpretation, emphasizing plague's transformative economic effects, highlighted the dramatic increase in wages following labor scarcity, the shift from arable to pastoral agriculture driven by labor shortages, the decline of serfdom resulting from enhanced peasant bargaining power, and the urban craft sector's reorganization in response to changed market conditions, creating a narrative of plague-driven economic revolution that fundamentally altered England's economic structures. The revisionist interpretations that emerged from more detailed studies of local and regional economies emphasized the diversity of responses to plague across different contexts, the persistence of many pre-plague economic patterns despite demographic change, and the importance of factors beyond population decline, including climatic variations, technological changes, and political developments in shaping economic transformations. The synthesis perspectives that acknowledge both change and continuity recognize plague's significant impacts on specific economic variables, including real wages and land values, while also noting that many fundamental economic structures persisted with modifications rather than experiencing wholesale transformation. The demographic historian's reconstruction of England's population history from medieval through early modern periods relies heavily on evidence from sources whose coverage and reliability vary considerably across time periods and social groups, creating methodological challenges that influence estimates of both pre-plague population levels and the extent of plague mortality. The Domesday Book of 1086 provides the most comprehensive pre-plague population evidence, though its coverage excludes several regions, and its household enumeration requires assumptions about household size to estimate total population. The manorial records that document tenant holdings and obligations provide evidence for tracking population changes in specific localities, though their coverage remains uneven, and their interpretation requires careful attention to changing terminology and recording practices. The parish registers that became standard after Thomas Cromwell's 1538 order requiring systematic baptism and burial recording provide more complete and reliable demographic evidence than earlier sources, though their implementation proceeded gradually and many early registers were lost or poorly maintained. The hearth tax returns of the later 17th century enumerate households for taxation purposes, providing comprehensive coverage that enables population estimation for the period immediately following plague's disappearance from England. The integration of evidence from these diverse sources through demographic reconstruction techniques, including back projection and family reconstitution, has enabled increasingly sophisticated estimates of historical population levels and 24 rights, vital rates. Though uncertainties remain particularly for earlier periods, where source coverage is limited. The comparative analysis of plague's impacts across different European regions reveals both common patterns in epidemic mortality and demographic recovery, and significant variations in the timing, severity, and long-term consequences of plague that reflected diverse political, economic, social, and environmental contexts. The Mediterranean regions, including Italy and Iberia, experienced plague's initial arrival somewhat earlier than Northern Europe, and continued experiencing major outbreaks later than England's final epidemic, creating longer overall periods of plague recurrence that influenced demographic and economic trajectories differently than the shorter English plague period. The German territories and Central Europe experienced particularly severe mortality during the Black Death, and continued suffering from recurring outbreaks through the 18th century, with some regions experiencing population decline more prolonged than England's relatively rapid late medieval demographic recovery. The Scandinavian countries received plague later than more southerly regions due to their geographic peripherality and experienced distinctive outbreak patterns influenced by their sparse populations, dispersed settlement patterns, and climatic conditions affecting flea and rodent biology. The Eastern European regions, including Poland and Russia, experienced plague patterns influenced by their connections to Central Asian trade routes and their different political and social structures that affected both disease transmission and demographic responses to mortality. The comparative perspective reveals that while plague created broadly similar demographic crises across diverse European contexts, the specific impacts and long-term consequences varied substantially, depending on local conditions and the ways different societies responded to epidemic challenges. The question of plague's role in European historical development more broadly, including debates about its influence on the transition from medieval to early modern periods, the emergence of capitalism, the transformation of state structures, and the cultural changes associated with the Renaissance and Reformation, has generated extensive scholarly discussion that connects plague history to major interpretative frameworks for understanding European civilization's evolution. The argument that plague's demographic crisis contributed to feudalism's collapse by disrupting the social relationships and economic arrangements underlying feudal organization emphasizes labor scarcity's effects on peasant bargaining power, the commutation of labor services into cash payments, and the difficulty of enforcing traditional obligations in circumstances where workers could exit unsatisfactory arrangements. The interpretation emphasizing plague's role in enabling capitalist development through the creation of wage labor markets, the commercialization of economic relationships, and the accumulation of capital by survivors who inherited wealth from deceased relatives connects demographic change to fundamental economic transformations associated with capitalism's emergence. The analysis of plague's effects on state development argues that epidemic management necessitated expanded governmental capacity and created precedents for state intervention in areas including public health, social welfare, and economic regulation that contributed to the modern state's emergence. The cultural history interpretations that connect plague to Renaissance humanism's emphasis on human mortality and individual experience, or to Reformation theology's focus on personal faith and divine judgment, suggest intellectual and spiritual consequences extending beyond immediate social and economic impacts. The Black Death in England, viewed from the perspective of its complete historical arc from 1348 through 1666, and considered in terms of its continuing influences on English society, economy, culture, and institutions, extending far beyond the epidemic period itself, represents one of the most significant events in English history, with impacts comparable to major political transformations like the Norman Conquest or the English Reformation. The pandemic's demographic catastrophe, social disruptions, economic transformations, religious influences, cultural impacts, and institutional consequences shaped English development across the late medieval and early modern periods, while creating legacies that persisted into the modern era through changed social structures, evolved economic practices, transformed cultural attitudes, and developed institutional capabilities. The study of England's plague history continues engaging historians, scientists, and general audiences seeking to understand both the specific historical processes that characterize this particular epidemic experience and the broader patterns of disease impacts on human societies that plague exemplifies. The relevance of this history for contemporary concerns about pandemic preparedness, public health policy, social inequality, and institutional resilience ensures that England's Black Death will remain a vital subject of investigation and reflection for future generations, confronting their own challenges with epidemic disease and seeking historical guidance for understanding and responding to these timeless human vulnerabilities. The centuries through which plague moved in England, beginning in the middle of the 14th century and ending in the middle of the 17th, constituted not only a medical episode, but a transformation of the relationship between population, environment, and authority, whose consequences endured long after the disease itself had vanished. What began as biological invasion became a long experiment in adaptation through which English society discovered new forms of labor, governance, and belief. The institutions that arose to confront catastrophe, parish administration, civic regulation, medical observation, and charitable relief proved durable frameworks for later stability. By the time plague disappeared, it had already remade the foundations upon which modern England would stand. The first impact was demographic. The sudden reduction of people by perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 destroyed the equilibrium of land and labor that had shaped medieval economy. Scarcity of workers raised wages, transformed servile tenure into contractual employment, and allowed peasants to bargain with landlords on unprecedented terms. Abandoned holdings turned to pasture, accelerating the wool trade that drew England into continental markets. Labour scarcity weakened feudal coercion and strengthened the cash economy, establishing habits of negotiation and written agreement that survived long after population recovered. The catastrophe that depopulated the countryside thus generated a new sense of individual agency within economic life. Replacing inherited obligation with the logic of exchange, the moral and psychological responses to mortality were equally profound. The late medieval imagination became saturated with death's imagery: skulls, hourglasses, cadaver tombs, and painted dances of death, reminding all ranks of their common fate. Such expressions did not produce despair so much as discipline. Constant exposure to death cultivated introspection, contrition, and preparation for salvation. In this atmosphere, the call for personal piety and the questioning of clerical authority took root, preparing the ground for later Reformation emphases on conscience and faith. The plague centuries accustomed the English conscience to self-examination, making inward belief as vital as outward ritual. Religious explanation coexisted with growing empirical curiosity. Clergy and physicians alike sought causes in the movements of stars, the corruption of air, or the failings of human conduct. But their very attempts to trace connection fostered habits of observation. Parish clerks who recorded deaths, officials who counted the sick, and merchants who tracked mortality to guide trade, all contributed to a numerical awareness of society. The weekly bills of mortality in London, beginning in the last decade of the 16th century and regular from 1603, created a precedent for systematic data. When John Graunt analysed those figures half a century later, he turned plague arithmetic into population science. Thus, the routine of counting deaths became the seed of public health and statistical reasoning. Institutionally, plague demanded coordination that educated the English state in administration. Parish officers enforced quarantines, distributed relief, and supervised burials. Justices of the peace issued orders linking local and central authority. Each outbreak rehearsed the procedures of information collection, inspection, and supply that later served taxation, welfare, and colonial enterprise. The discipline of emergency management matured into the bureaucracy of ordinary governance. The habit of regulating private conduct for public safety created enduring debates about liberty and obligation that would echo through later centuries whenever the state extended its reach in the name of security. Architecture and urban planning also absorbed plague's lessons. Medieval towns of timber and thatch, their narrow lanes filled with refuse, had offered perfect environments for contagion. Rebuilding after successive fires and epidemics introduced brick, tile, and broader streets, imposing rational order on organic confusion. Drainage, paved thoroughfares, and regulated water supply emerged as civic priorities. The New London, rising after the Great Fire of 1666, embodied the culmination of 2 centuries of reform, durable, ventilated, and symbolically purified. Even though plague never returned to test those improvements, the very design of the rebuilt city remained a monument to the determination that disorder and pestilence should never again dominate urban life. Culturally, plague survived as metaphor long after it ceased as reality. Language of infection and contagion migrated from medicine into politics and morality, describing heresy, corruption, or rebellion. In literature, from moral tracts to drama, pestilence served as emblem of invisible decay within the body politic. Such imagery kept alive the memory of collective vulnerability and reinforced the conviction that moral health and physical health were inseparable. The persistence of these metaphors reveals how completely epidemic experience had entered the national vocabulary of anxiety and reform. Economic behavior also carried plague's imprint. The experience of scarcity taught both prudence and innovation. Landowners diversified production. Merchants developed networks to offset local failure. Guilds consolidated to regulate labor supply. Adaptation to repeated crisis cultivated resilience, encouraging saving, record-keeping, and contractual clarity. The society that emerged valued foresight as moral virtue. When later wars and commercial fluctuations tested the economy, the habits forged under plague flexibility, calculation, and cooperation proved decisive. Population recovery after the 15th century transformed the meaning of people from mere subjects to measurable assets. Counting ceased to be an act of mourning and became one of policy. Political arithmetic treated population as the wealth of the realm, to be preserved through health, sanitation, and employment. The same techniques once used to chart death now served to promote life. The state's interest in the welfare of its citizens, though still rudimentary, represented a reversal of plague's arithmetic, from the subtraction of lives to their deliberate multiplication. The intellectual consequences reached beyond medicine. The confrontation between divine providence and natural causation produced a style of reasoning that could respect faith while seeking mechanism. Observers accepted that divine will might act through natural processes, and by studying those processes, they honored rather than denied providence. This reconciliation allowed empirical inquiry to flourish within a religious culture. The physicians who compared symptoms, tested remedies, and recorded observations anticipated the method later formalized in experimental science. Plague had forced practice to precede theory. Necessity created empiricism before philosophy justified it. Education and record-keeping, repeatedly interrupted by mortality, developed new strategies for continuity. Universities instituted statutes to preserve endowments and succession during vacancies. Guilds and parishes accumulated archives to maintain identity despite loss. The documentary habit born of fear became a cornerstone of English institutional culture. By writing down every transaction, covenant, and death, society sought permanence against oblivion. The abundance of surviving records that allows modern historians to reconstruct these centuries is itself one of plague's paradoxical gifts. Politically, the management of contagion sharpened the tools of centralized power. Quarantine, surveillance, and control of movement required enforcement across jurisdictions. Cooperation between local officials and crown authority during emergencies demonstrated the practicality of governance extending into private life. These precedents legitimized later state intervention in commerce, morality, and health. The same logic that justified closing theaters during plague would reappear in regulating markets and factories. The common good could demand temporary sacrifice of liberty. The moral dilemma, first articulated in epidemic decrees, how far protection may restrain freedom, remains embedded in modern governance. When plague at last vanished after the year 1666, it left a society profoundly changed. England had moved from feudal agriculture to a diversified commercial economy, from organic medieval towns to ordered brick cities, from inherited hierarchy to contractual relationships, from clerical intercession to personal conscience, and from speculation to measurement. Each transformation bore the mark of necessity imposed by centuries of mortality. The disease's departure did not end its influence. It merely revealed how deeply that influence had been absorbed. In memory and imagination, the Black Death became both warning and origin. Later generations looked back upon it as the catastrophe that disciplined a nation. The chronicles that once recorded divine punishment were reread as narratives of endurance. The conviction that suffering could yield progress, that affliction could be transmuted into strength, entered English moral identity. The rhetoric of providential testing, later used to describe military and imperial challenges, drew upon the older memory of pestilence survived and mastered. Through this moral transfiguration, disaster was converted into destiny. Modern science eventually gave plague its name and microbe, confirming through experiment what centuries of observation had only guessed. Yet, that knowledge did not erase the older meanings. The rediscovery of Yersinia pestis in the 19th century completed a scientific cycle whose first measurements had been made by clerks with quills. The laboratories that sequenced its genome in the 20th and 21st centuries stood at the end of a tradition of watching, recording, and reasoning that the medieval plague itself had inaugurated. The continuity between those distant observers and modern epidemiology reminds humanity that understanding is born from endurance. The moral questions that plague first posed, how to balance personal freedom with public safety, how to care for the vulnerable, how to interpret calamity without surrendering to despair, remain perennial. Each new epidemic renews debates first rehearsed in medieval England. The institutions that today manage quarantine, relief, and surveillance are direct descendants of those parish systems devised 600 years ago. Beneath their modern machinery lies the same moral architecture of duty, compassion, and restraint. Thus, the history of plague in England does not conclude with its extinction, but with its transformation into legacy. What began as terror ended as discipline. What appeared as divine wrath became a catalyst for reason. What destroyed communities taught them how to govern, record, and rebuild. The England that emerged from those 3 centuries of affliction possessed the administrative competence, empirical curiosity, and moral resilience that would sustain its later rise. In its ordered cities, in its census ledgers, in its hospitals and public records, the imprint of the Black Death remains an invisible architecture of vigilance, shaping the modern world. The catastrophe that once darkened every parish became, through endurance and adaptation, the silent foundation of England's continuing capacity to survive, to reform, and to understand itself anew.